Raz, dwa, trzy, raz, dwa. Raz, dwa, trzy, raz, dwa. Hop, hop, raz, dwa, trzy. Raz, dwa, a tego słychać w ogóle? Dawid, on jest zgłośniony, raz, dwa, tak
Nawet chyba zajęcia z panią miałem jeszcze za czasów studenckich, więc znamy się oczywiście.
Grouping experts and scientists cooperating with WSPA. The mission, most important, informing about Polish international policies, also to integrate the circles of Lublin around international policy, diplomacy in the EU. And today's conference is yet another event when we will be discussing important, up-to-date matters and of key importance for our country from the perspective of security and geostrategic position on the map of Europe. Honorable ladies and gentlemen, before we move on to planned discussions and panels, I will introduce you briefly to the topic. Due to my educational background, international relations, here are my lectures when I was a student still, and led by masters like Professor Marek Pietracz, Janusz, and Professor Domała. I have the ambition to say a few words of introduction to the topic, which will also introduce you into the climate of the conference. So, contemporary architecture of international security is subject to dynamic and deep transformations, symbolized by full-scale aggression of Russian Federation on Ukraine in 2022. This event not only questions foundations of post-war order, but based on, but also showed traditional limitations of traditional diplomacy using hybrid methods and again a question about effectiveness of activities together aimed at shaping narration, building coalition, mobilizing the international support and exerting political pressure on the aggressor. At the same time, Europe must cope with expanding consequence of powers far behind the Atlantic Treaty, tensions in Israel, Palestinian, and also rivalry with Arabic countries generate new challenges, influencing global influence and internal European security. Similar constant pressure from Chinese Republic on Taiwan is one of the key information points. A possible escalation in Taiwan strides could have economic and political consequences in Europe. Conference Diplomacy with War in the Background puts forth a multi-analysis of these events as a goal to show how the situation influences shaping strategic interests of countries. This is also an attempt at answering a question how European countries may adapt their activities in the conditions of growing uncertainty and global tension to protect peace and own security. I am deeply convinced that today's event will be a feast intellectually, and conclusions will be a valuable material combining academic knowledge and also international practice. And ladies and gentlemen, moving on now to the first point of our conference, it will be an online conversation titled Diplomacy in the Time of War, NATO and Aggression of Russia on Ukraine. Tomasz Stępniewski, professor of expert of Timiro Direct and consultant of Lubelski, and online, Mr. Dominik Jankowski, director of the Committee for Economy and Security from NATO, who will be talking to us from Brussels. The floor is yours, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Chancellor. Please allow me to sit, because in this way I will be able to see Mr. Dominik Jankowski, who is getting connected with us. I hope we can already hear so far. Regarding Dominik Jankowski, ladies and gentlemen, he works at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and recently took head of Commission of Security in North Atlantic Treaty in Brussels. So he has a very important position in context of negotiations, negotiating peace diplomacy, and I don't know if we can hear him, and we are heard. Now, a question to our technicians. Good. Mr. Dominik, I can see is nodding his head that he is not hearing us. No. 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 But we can hear you, sir. That's good. At least one way. Oh ho, don't you hear me? Hello? Hello? And now? Now I can hear you. Good morning. Good morning, Dominik, once again. So we are moving on to the first question related to Ukraine and aid for Ukraine. And of course, is this aid effectively implemented? But first of all, in the context of whether this diplomacy is really effectively carrying out assistance aid for Ukraine. Is it possible to convince all NATO members to grant help to Ukraine fighting with against the Russian aggressor? Dominik? Thank you very much, Professor. Very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Very briefly, about support for Ukraine and the role of diplomacy in this respect, and of course the role of diplomacy in dimension as a target for granting military, economic and financial assistance. This diplomacy over the recent 3 years, actually from the beginning of the war, its main objective, of course, apart from leading to ending that conflict, was effectively implementing deliveries of military aid within the NATO or within structures which are around the alliance, let's call them, because not all the aid until 2024 was carried out by the NATO, and even greater proportion of it was formally going outside the structures. But a lot of discussion within the alliance was devoted to actually adding up to shortages in Ukrainian capacity and convincing undecided European allies at a certain stage by the Americans and later by European allies to the Americans to continue deliveries to Ukraine. So without diplomacy, without continuous negotiations, continuous internal discussions, many diplomatic mechanisms or military mechanisms could not be created. A specific example. By the end of 2023, at the beginning of 2024, discussion began about increasing the role of the NATO in military aid for Ukraine, so taking over by the NATO of part of the tasks which until that moment were carried out by mainly under the umbrella of the US in cooperation with other European allies within the formats existing outside the structures of the alliance. And for many months, such negotiations, diplomatic attempts also from the American side, who wanted to partly get rid of this coordination role because, and effectively at the Washington summit in July 2024, finally it was done within the NATO. A structure was established, NSAT, briefly it's NATO mission for Ukraine, which took over part or great proportion of the coordination regarding military support for Ukraine. So now let's move to the next question, which I dare say is of key importance because conflict of Russia and Ukraine is, of course, about Russian aggression on Ukraine. But first of all, on how to negotiate with Russia. And here a question addressing you in the context of experience between NATO negotiating with Russia and future peace negotiations. We can see that Russia effectively avoids taking up the effective negotiations. They are more pretended than real, we would dare say. And what does it look like from the NATO perspective? Is there a pressure on Russia to take up these negotiations, or rather there is an expectation that Russia would take up the first step? Well, most welcome. So perhaps first let me start from how the NATO position evolved regarding negotiations with the Russian party directly, because let's keep in mind that by the end of 2021 and at the beginning of 2022, NATO directly talked to the Russians, among others in the format of the NATO-Russia Council. The last of them was held in January 2022. So just before the war, many allies using NATO instruments and using involvement of Secretary General himself were trying to the diplomatic path in relations with Russia, as we know, unsuccessfully, which in my opinion also to a great extent allowed, first of all, the Western allies to understand what is the approach of Russian Federation to diplomacy and peace talks, and to the very question of utilizing instrument of the dialogue to solve the problem. So now there is no strange belief that, I mean, people don't doubt that Russia is not aiming at peace. Of course, nobody will reject peace path. Diplomacy is a key instrument in the catalogue of instruments the allies control, but at the same time, everybody are aware of the limitation in current relations, both between the Russian party and the allies. The trust to the Russian side is very limited. Well, over the recent months, take the example of American-Russian summit in Alaska and activities taken up by the Russians just a moment after the summit ended. So amassed rocket and drone attacks on Ukraine don't leave any doubt among American administration, even if American administration is among leaders of this process now to search for peace. And now, well, today, further signals appear about ideas to have a diplomatic solution. Well, as I said, nobody on the NATO side, among the alliance, would not reject the diplomatic solution, but that diplomatic solution must provide Ukraine with sovereignty and power of defense, and it must not limit it regarding development of military capacity. So there are many conditions which we, of course, as alliance, we are not putting them forth, but our Ukrainian partners very clearly formulate their expectations, and therefore, thus they build our conviction about what their approach to the peace negotiations is. So let us say the key element now in these negotiations will be building a strong Ukrainian position. This strong Ukrainian position must both be reflected by specific military capacity, so further support through delivery of equipment and arms and developing capacity of arms-related industry in Ukraine, and of course continuing training for Ukrainian soldiers. And on the other hand, at the same time, we have to keep in mind that gradually we'll have to be rebuilding Ukrainian state, and of course financially continue supporting Ukrainians financially to provide relatively stable position as much as it is possible in the military situation, economic position. So these elements are many, but really our goal now should be strengthening negotiation position of Ukraine as much as possible, and these elements which I mentioned will serve this purpose. So let me ask additionally, in the context of European members of North Atlantic Treaty, well, is opinion increasing that the US are more and more withdrawing or are declaring, and to some extent are doing this, that they are withdrawing their forces from European continent? And we hear about these initiatives of European countries which are aimed at supporting Ukraine as well, but whether the alliance an opinion is increasing that now it is time for European partners who are to take over responsibility for development of the situation in the east of Europe and also play the first planned role in solving this conflict. Do you see such a debate, a discussion possible? Is negotiations in progress within the alliance? Well, Professor, for sure, there is an increasing opinion that the Europeans must be doing more in the context of long-term support for Ukraine. Of course, there is no doubt about it, and independent from the fact what American rhetoric says, also former American administration clearly pointed at the fact that European involvement must be increasing. It must be increasing both regarding military capacity, which we are passing on to the Ukrainian side, scope and dynamics of trainings, and also providing the stable funding, so relative stability in economic situation. So an initial comment that would be. And the second element, of course, there are parallel discussions going on where Europeans are leading in them, and they have a decisive internal opinion about the shape of these discussions. One of them is related to security matter. It is indirectly related to various bilateral documents which since 2024 individual European countries were signing with Ukraine. Each NATO country, with maybe a few exceptions, signed such memorandums regarding broadly understood, maybe not always security guarantees, but agreements aimed at long-term supporting Ukraine as a target. Of course, practical elements remain related to security guarantees, and it is not possible to assure security for Ukraine without involvement of European countries. Well, geography itself forces on European countries to think over to what degree, of course, after concluding the war, they will be able to get physically involved on the territory of Ukraine, and what equipment long-term they will be able to hand over, in what scale and scope, and what units they will be ready to train. And of course, there is production component there too. So how much from European industrial production, of course, in cooperation with the Ukrainian party, will be done on the territory of Ukraine. These discussions are going on, and in the coalition of the willing parties, so in the process, actually led by the UK and with support of Germany. This is one element, but a lot is being said that this American support for Ukraine is dropping, is limited, reduced. Well, the rhetorics is relatively clear, but putting rhetorics aside, I mean that from American administration, let me ask your attention at the fact that before the summit in Hague, a decision was made to create a new initiative to finance military capacity of Ukraine, so-called PEARL, initiative which is actually aimed at mobilizing European allies to purchase arms in the U.S. To provide long-term delivery of military equipment from the U.S. to Ukraine. This results from several elements. Of course, the most important element of this initiative was to provide support for Ukraine. Also by continuation of deliveries of American arms on which a lot of military of Ukraine is basing. And the other element, European countries or European arms industry in a limited size was capable of providing for the allies and increase deliveries to Ukraine. And it is a challenge for the current arms industry located in Europe, and therefore this new American initiative signed by General Secretary Mr. Rutte is aimed at maintaining American involvement in the support. And again, here, in getting to this initiative and implementing it effectively, a great role was in actually the elements of diplomacy behind the scenes. So they provide long-term or at least increase long-term support, military support for Ukraine. And a moment ago, I heard the input by Deputy Prime Minister Mr. Sikorski for the media, and Poland is also will also support the PEARL initiative soon. And I would like to ask about the so-called coalition of unwilling countries to support Ukraine within the NATO, because our conference is about negotiations. So if you can share this knowledge from the inside of the alliance, how you managed to convince the countries which are skeptical. Well, the first example of Hungary comes to our mind, but we can see that in Central European countries, more and more governments start expressing not so very pro-Ukrainian statements. They are not very willing to support Ukraine. So this, of course, is translated onto the North Atlantic Treaty. So maybe a little bit about convincing the undecided or the unwilling to support Ukraine, because let's keep in mind that this is related to security of the whole Central and Eastern Europe. So therefore it is of key importance from the perspective of interest of Poland, but also countries on the eastern side of the NATO. Yes, actually, Professor, coalition of the unwilling ones is a very good term. So perhaps let's put it like this. There are various mechanisms within which actually in these talks those who are more willing, those alliance members, are trying to show why it is worthwhile, and if they do not succeed in convincing the others, so this is the second element. The most important is to avoid those countries to block further activities of the alliance in this respect, because please remember, contrary to some activities on the EU side where it is possible to take up decisions by the majority of votes. In the NATO case, consensus is always demanded. So that's an example. I think it is best to show on examples how we managed to convince those unconvinced parties. The famous 2024 and that NATO mission for Ukraine of NSAT. The Hungarian party were not hiding from the beginning of these negotiations that they did not accept such a solution for various reasons. I think of secondary importance for your question they are, but Secretary General, and I think it was an important element too in this process, diplomatic process, took over the role of the mediator, the one who as the one who initiated that idea, tried to convince the Hungarian party to get involved in more active way, to get involved in NSAT, which was not successful. The Hungarian party did not accept getting involved, and then the next element of that process was moving on to the second stage, to Plan B. That means assuring that the Hungarian party will not block this process. So in NATO terminology, there is no opt-out formally mentioned, as it is possible in EU solutions. So formally, the Hungarians did not oppose to establishing the NSAT, but they got themselves excluded both from financial support of the initiative and from involvement by sending specific officers to NSAT headquarters in Germany. That's one element. The second element important in this initiative, and specifically showing how you can encourage the unwilling ones, it is a new threshold alliance countries have to reach in spending on arms, where a very important role was played by the US, political role, because from military perspective, this new threshold of 5%, that means 3.5 for the tough spending and 1.5 for soft security. From military perspective, it results from the reality and specific requirements resulting from the military NATO reasons. So the next element motivating those unwilling countries is that assistance for Ukraine, both military and financing Ukrainian arms industry, can be included in spending for arms in those countries. So countries who are not spending so much for their own military help them reach this new level of 3.5 and then 1.5 so of GDP for defense purposes. So most important element, which is leading many alliances in NATO, is non-isolating those who oppose to this initiative or various initiatives, but more convincing them by specific arguments, let's say financial points to reach new spending level for defense to at least not block those initiatives. It was done so far successfully. None of those unwilling countries so far blocked a new important NATO initiative regarding supporting Ukraine. Good. And in this context of negotiations, I wanted to ask about negotiations with the EU, or situation with the NATO and the EU, because within member states of the EU, there is a growing opinion that the EU should be responsible for European security and should be strengthening its strategic autonomy. Here, the leading role of France in forming the debate on European security with the leading role of the EU. And what does this look like from the perspective of North Atlantic Treaty? Because as we know very well, for European security, North Atlantic Treaty is responsible, but the EU as the soft power. But what is changing is the geopolitical situation. There's a war between Russia and Ukraine, and forces on the EU also thinking in the context of securing their interests in building effective resilience. And now, how is this perceived by member states of the North Atlantic Treaty? Somehow this will to establish a safe Europe with a leading role of the EU. Is this possible from NATO perspective, or is it just discussion, a debate within the EU, but really for security in the nearest future, the alliance will be responsible? Well, it is a highly complex question, so I will do my best to answer it in two elements, Professor. So the first element, absolutely there is nothing negative in the fact that the EU, to a greater extent, is taking over the burden of responsibility for European security. This is a good trend also because the EU has very specific instruments, among others, financial ones or industrial ones, regarding reconstruction of our production capacity. So realistically, for us to be able to get ready for this future war about which we keep hearing from many sides, we have to have the capacity to produce specific systems, military systems, and to add to cover the gaps in the existing systems, among others regarding air defense and among others, or increasing production of artillery ammunition. So there is no doubt whether European initiatives which are aiming at reconstructing our defense potential can only have an input into increasing our defense readiness. And now, will the EU be able to carry out effective operation or to defend European territory? No, because the most important element in preparing us Europeans for defense is military plan. And the only organization that has a ready-made, regularly tested plan, based on which also expectations are elaborated regarding capacity, which I'm talking about, are in the hands of the NATO. So as Dominik Jankowski, myself, I would have to answer the question if I prefer to be defended by the NATO or by the EU. I think that, at least for Poland, the best solution is for the NATO to be providing us with a strategic military defense umbrella, of course, in which we have to continue with our readiness drills, exercises, and regional cooperation. But I want to highlight that this EU effort, as long as it is strengthening readiness of European countries within the alliance, is beneficial from the perspective of the alliance itself, and it is noticeable within the alliance, also noticeable by countries from outside the NATO, like the US or the UK or Norway. Of course, there are gentle elements in negotiations which are going on currently. That means whether countries like the UK may join Instrument SAFE, and then if so, then how? These are difficult negotiations which to a great extent are related to capacity of European defense industry and the fact of how much of the EU funds should go to European industry. So I understand that there is an element of economic and industrial security in this process. It doesn't change the fact that the trajectory of EU decisions is beneficial for the eastern flank of the NATO. Yes, and now the last question regarding parliamentary diplomacy, because we are talking all the time about war or diplomacy with war in the background. What is parliamentary diplomacy, and are we noticing the increased importance of parliamentary diplomacy in contemporary world? We are more after the Parliamentary Assembly of the NATO, but I would ask you to diagnose the state of this process. Well, of course, the primary role in diplomacy is played by the government side, or more broadly, state administration / presidential one, with Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the main role. But it doesn't change the fact that over the recent years we should notice the increased importance of using parliamentary diplomacies like Parliamentary Assembly of the NATO and more broadly institutions like European Parliament to carry out international discussions, of course, within the competences of those bodies or those institutions. My observations, which seem to be very bold, among others, the Ukrainian party very often use the parliamentary channel to signal somewhere there are additional needs or their expectations, which may not always be getting through in the intergovernmental dialogue, or they do not get priority in that dialogue. So this is the first element I noticed. The second element is, of course, in broader discussion about reconstruction of defense potential in allied countries, which of course will be based on defense spending. The key role will be played by the MPs. Because they every year decide, among others, about defense budget. They vote finally for the shape of the budget of each allied state. So it is very important to involve the MPs in those processes more broadly so that they can better translate decisions or discussions held on international forum onto domestic decisions which are needed to provide a proper budgeting of funds for defense matters. And let me give you an example. Within the NATO Parliamentary Assembly regularly, the Weimar Triangle states spend by the session negotiated among MPs, and they additionally support this intergovernmental message from governments and Weimar Treaty. So wrapping up, role of the MPs in diplomacy is growing, but it must be channeled appropriately, and therefore such institutions like Parliamentary Assembly of the NATO exist in order to create certain frames for this discussion, shaping and increasing transatlantic security. Good. Mr. Director, all what is good ends well, and soon we are ending our discussion because we know that in a moment you are going to the next meeting. Therefore, our guest was Mr. Dominik Jankowski, Director of the Committee for Economic and Security Matters in NATO Assembly in Brussels. Thank you very much for multi-theme discussion. We wish you a lot of successes and effectively representing interests of Poland within the Parliamentary Assembly of the NATO. Thank you very kindly. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I wish you a fruitful conference. Thank you. Goodbye. And let me hand over the floor to Mr. Chancellor. And moving on to the next point on our agenda. Welcome. Thank you, Professor, Mr. Director, for very interesting opinions. In the audience, we have students from international relations course of studies. I think you can see a growing role of diplomacy, maybe a niche for you for the future. As graduates, you may wish to go towards diplomacy, which I do wish you. And honorable ladies and gentlemen, we are moving on to the next part of our agenda. On the agenda, we have two discussion panels, and the first one here, War in Ukraine, New Geopolitical Reality of Central and Eastern Europe. This is the title of the first discussion panel, to which you are now kindly invited. Please let me introduce and invite moderator of the discussion and panelists, Dr. Alista Zyguła, graduate of Ukrainian language, Doctor of Security in 2015 till 21, Deputy Consul in Vinica in Ukraine. Big hand, Madam Doctor. And regarding panelists, we will have a breakdown into those who will be online and those who will be here with us. Regarding panelists who will be online, it will be Dr. Gediminas Kazenas from Michał Romer University in Vilnius in Lithuania. Are you with us? Yes, we are connected online. And we'll also have Dr. Karol Kubica, Director of the Foreign Trade Office in Kiev and Lvov, in Polish Agency for Investment and Trade. Is Karol with us online? Yes. And regarding the panelists here, let me welcome and invite Dr. Maria Mazur, Rector of WSPA in Lublin, and let me also invite Dr. Jarosław Kit, also lecturer in WSPA in Lublin, also lecturer at International Relations course of studies. And now, Madam Doctor, the floor is yours. Please moderate the panel. We have 90 minutes available for the panel. Honorable ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure that I have the opportunity and pleasure to moderate this very panel because, war in Ukraine, new geopolitical reality of Central and Eastern Europe. I'm very glad that we have international panel. We will touch on problems which were evoked by war in Ukraine in macro and micro scales, because we will be talking about the changes which appeared internationally, and very important will be opinion from Dr. Gediminas Kazenas from Lithuania. Very warm welcome to you, Doctor, once again. And very important opinion of a hands-on practitioner who has been actually practicing diplomacy with war in the background, because Karol Kubica from Lublin, let me reveal the secret, for many years has been working in Ukraine and actually hands-on practicing this diplomacy, because Karol Kubica, as head of the Foreign Trade and Investment Office, is supporting Polish-Ukrainian economic relations. So there's diplomacy, economic diplomacy, in the best shape from the perspective of Kiev, Lvov, and will be accompanying us today. Ladies and gentlemen, following the opinion about Krasav is that war is a continuation of politics using different means only. So we're highlighting that war is not replacing politics, and it gives a new impulse to diplomacy. And as we know perfectly well, we are watching situation internationally. We face the redefinition of many phenomena and processes, and the conflict in Ukraine is a kind of a laboratory where we can see visible and tested old processes, paradigms, and we can see the birth of new phenomena. Now, taking the opportunity that we are connected to Mr. Karol Kubica, and war can any moment break this connection. So let us talk of the situation in Ukraine. And I would like to ask this economic diplomacy about economic processes. As we know, Poland is for Ukraine one of very important trade partners, economic partners. But after the full-scale war started, Polish-Ukrainian economic relations have the burden of many risks. And about this, how economy is coping with war in the background, and about the relations of the economic diplomacy, what they look like. Let me ask Mr. Karol Kubica how business is coping with it, how economy is coping with it, and how now the Polish-Ukrainian trade relations look like. Good morning, a very warm welcome from Lvov, and thank you for the invitation. A pity I cannot be with you in person in my hometown with you, although I'm not very far, actually, because it is 280 kilometers from Lublin. Today in Lvov, in the street, we hear the power generating units after a mass attack on Tarnopol and Lvov yesterday. We simply do not have electricity available. So situation is regarding the society is very difficult, but both Ukrainian citizens and entrepreneurs do their best to cope with the challenges they are facing. And today, the greatest problem is lack of power supply, followed by lack of water, lack of heat, district heating, and both from the perspective of society, but Polish production plants which are struggling with such problems because certain production processes cannot be stopped just like that and switched on back in 2 hours' time. There is shortage of labor for work because men are being taken to Ukrainian army. Women are taking over male professions in Ukraine. So situation is difficult, although we may say that here not only soldiers are heroes, but Ukrainian society also, in spite of the great difficulties, is doing their best to operate normally, and we got used to certain things. Simply regarding business, Polish business for many years has been present in the Ukrainian market. It acts vividly, and in spite of war and all these difficulties, did not withdraw from Ukraine. In the years 2014 till 2024, exports from Poland to Ukraine went up from $4 billion to $14 billion. Importation from Ukraine to Poland went up from 2 billion to 5 billion. Total value of trade in that period was over $115 billion, out of which exports was $77 million and importation $38 million. Here we have had since 2018, 2014. It's all the time growing tendency. Poland is number 2 trade partner to Ukraine. It's from Poland. Well, Ukrainian consumers, Ukrainian business looking for goods and services. Poland is the first country for them to look at the possibility to have delivery of certain products and services. So mathematically, looking in figures, we have a growth. And in spite of war, Poland is getting more and more strong partner to Ukraine. And here, unquestionably, we are strongly present in the market. And this is for us a great opportunity for economic cooperation. Many Polish production plants are in operation in Ukraine, like Fakro, Cersanit, Śnieżka, Modern Expo, Toruń injury. All these companies are working here. Some are investing in spite of war. During this war, they are investing in their machinery depot, in their production lines, because what used to be the edge of Ukraine, cheap labor, cheap energy, today is at the other side. And Polish business internationally in that number has to simply cope with all these things. We, as Poland, as Polish Agency for Investment and Trade, we joined forces into Team Poland from Ukraine, together with other entities from Polish Development Fund, where we have the full package of support for Polish business. Today, a Polish entrepreneur can ensure their exports contract, may ensure their goods for Ukrainian market, can ensure their investment from war risk. Polish business got tools from Polish governments supporting the operation in Ukrainian market. Also yesterday, in Sambor, a Polish company was destroyed by rocket attacks. A few months ago, Barlinek was destroyed in 70%. Some time ago, Polish company Fakro was hit by rockets, but in spite of the fact we are present in the market and our trade offices in Kiev and Lviv are operating and working, Polish business, we have over 5,000 Polish companies active in Ukrainian market, most of them which are in Kiev and in Lviv regions. So therefore our representations, our experts, we are present here at site. Tomorrow we will also be organizing a business breakfast. 40 Polish entrepreneurs are coming regarding customs procedures and border procedures, simplifications introduced by Ukrainian government. Ukrainian government is struggling with many problems, as you have probably heard. The recent corruption, big problem. It is also at a high level. Unfortunately, such activities do exist, but it was detected by anti-corruption authorities imposed by the government, and such behavior is not acceptable. Ukraine does not allow it, and it will be destroyed immediately by Ukrainian government. And also, there are lots of tenders and public procurement procedures organized. Polish business doesn't have to go to Ukraine to carry out business cooperation with Ukraine. We keep tracing all those tenders and orders and for supply of equipment to hospitals, to schools, equipping military with tactical clothes and long-term food, power generation units. All that is coming from Poland. These are tenders organized by World Bank, United Nations, and all types of Norwegian grants. This is safe money for Polish business. So I do encourage Polish businessmen to trace these tenders. They're all published. Odbudowa Ukrainy, PL. We are available for you. So it's also an office of every Polish entrepreneur. You can come, use it, and make an appointment for a meeting. Ukraine is a country outside the EU, so business is carried out in a specific way. We will not do business with by emails. No, you have to come here, meet, and our role is to protect and verify the contractor, provide a base of potential recipients, buyers on the Ukrainian market. And I do encourage for cooperation. We work for Ministry of Development and Technology. Our activities are 100% free of charge for Polish companies, but Polish companies, to our agency, international trade offices are approaching us from Korea, from Sweden, from the Netherlands, France, who view Poland as a hub, and cooperation via Polish companies into the Ukrainian market. Highly developed countries have funds, but do not let us be misled. Korean or Swedish companies will not come to reconstruct Ukraine. They may outline certain projects which will be won by Swedish companies, but they will be looking for cooperating companies, and we are actually having a great challenge facing us, and I think we can together help Ukrainian economy to get rebuilt, maybe not rebuilt, but modernized, because now modernization is going on. When you go in the street and travel in Ukraine, I keep seeing various projects of infrastructure, roads being implemented on the Ukrainian market. Closeness of Subcarpathian and also Lublin regions is of key importance in the future hub for reconstruction of Ukraine. And today our agency is in certain investments with the Koreans near home, which are aimed at supporting the processes in Ukraine. And we also can see a great possibility for cooperation with Ukrainian entrepreneurs who need Polish business, Polish thought and Polish technology, Polish experience in this process, in which over the recent 25 years, well, actually it was a great construction site, and thanks to funds from the EU, we were changing, we are getting modernized. We have the experience. We are most qualified among EU countries to support Ukraine in these tasks, and here construction companies, a lot of them, I can see today, are opening their representations, are opening their companies in the Ukrainian market, and I think this is the time to actually get placed in Ukraine today, to be looking for these partners, and together with us you can carry out various projects. The safest cooperation with Ukraine is exports. Well, we find a buyer, we sign a contract, well, ensure the loans, and it is safe for Poland. Even if a rocket destroys these goods, a Polish entrepreneur can obtain liquidated damages from insurance. Well, also supporting funds, which will be launched in a moment. One of the largest funds launched recently in Ukrainian markets, Ukrainian facility from the EU, Ukrainian Commission. European, so BGK, also for local governments and institutions in Ukraine, which will be implementing construction of hospitals and schools, modernization of their, and our task is also to train local government people. We are showing them good examples how our cities are working and technological parks are operating, how economic zones are working. Poland, what we can attract a foreign investor to come, and how Ukraine should be taking care of their business and give government guarantees for the business to exist. In spite of war, Ukrainian economy is really operating, working. Those macroeconomic indices are not so tragic, and they keep gradually, slowly going up. Ukraine got disconnected by war from cooperation with Russia, Belarus, and over the sea with Turkey and Asia. So Poland became the first window. They can gain various products and services, and our task is to support and provide good, diligent entrepreneurs to Ukrainian market. Thank you very much. So conclusions which come from what you are saying are that business is not afraid of war, and war only intensified this economic exchange. And what is worth highlighting, the Ukrainian state is working, and on the other hand, it must be working in order to cope with this burden of war. with those difficulties resulting from war for the state budget. I would like to ask, because you said that 5,000 Polish companies are currently present in Ukraine. Wasn't there a trend after the war broke out, after February 2022, that business in whatever way was withdrawing from Ukraine in the first moment, or was such a trend noticeable, or such a temporary slowdown, or not? That in spite of anything, this economic exchange was developing independent from war activities. So the beginning of the full-scale war, it was a stagnation because Ukrainians themselves didn't know what to do and how it would be developing, how it would go on. So here, everything stopped a little bit in Ukraine, but it lasted for some half a year, and after 2023, we note increase of Polish business. I mean, increase in registration of entities. Over 2,500 of Polish companies got additionally registered, and Polish business in the full-scale war entered the Ukrainian market. Ukraine has a lot of needs. You, madam, were for many years consul in Vinica, so you also saw Ukraine, how it was changing, how Ukrainian community needed European standards, and how Ukrainians who were going out and returning to Ukraine wanted also to introduce those changes. So I keep all my hope in young generation of Ukraine who currently may be outside the country, but they are seeing the relations that not only can be paying cash in envelopes under the table, but everything can be legal, invoiced, that this cooperation can be clear and transparent, and also change it, are building in legislation of Ukrainian certification of certain standards, because earlier those standards, well, they are still actually in operation from the Soviet Union time. So from in sewage treatment or sewage systems, companies, Polish companies who wanted to make a project for a World Bank, but the details, pipes in the tender were from the Soviet times. Nobody is producing them according to these standards now. So in Ukraine, these standards are being introduced, which business in the EU or globally is operating in, and we also notice these changes. So Polish business is stronger and stronger, more and more expansive, and first of all, Polish business is bold because it goes from travels from full-scale war. We did over 25 economic missions with over 180 Polish entrepreneurs participating, and our colleagues from embassies from Sweden, from Korea are asking, how is it possible? But it is the Polish business, Polish president of the company will come. No, not online. They are coming live. So they are shocked that Polish businessmen are bold. But it also shows Ukrainian partners that we are ready to export things, sell. But we want to cooperate with you. We want to co-act with you, and our activities are not only covering Lviv and Kiev, but in August we were in Odessa, Polish business. Many a time we spent the night in the shelter. It is tough, and I can see in my local employees where women have children, but we come to work after a night without sleep, after cold, but we have to work, we have to act. Again, there is an alarm. People are worried. They call school, kindergarten, if children are in the shelter or not. This actually depresses them very much. It is very tough, but, well, I think we got used to COVID in Poland as well, and we stopped being afraid and stopped washing hands 10 times a day. So when I'm looking at Ukraine, people simply started getting used to it, and you have to operate, you have to live, you cannot give in, and we have to go forward. And this is our task for Poland, to be supporting Ukraine in this modernization and reconstruction. Thank you very much, Karol. And I'm sure this Polish-Ukrainian economic exchange would not be possible to keep developing so well without you. You are involved in these processes, and you have been for many years. Yes, the whole team. Yes, of course, the whole team, but you are heading the team, therefore you are very strongly involved in these processes. And in spite of the difficult conditions you mentioned, you are not returning home, but you are active there, and you are also ambassador of these matters, the economic diplomacy in Ukraine. Thank you very kindly for time you spent to share your experience with us, and we wish you endurance and great courage so that this optimism is with you in all your activities. Once again, thank you very much. And now, thank you very much. And please let me invite Polish entrepreneurs to cooperation. We are here for you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have online also our guest from Lithuania, Dr. Gediminas Kazenas from Michał Romer University in Vilnius. We would now like to move on to this level of diplomacy, to international area, and touch on those problems which, as I mentioned initially, war redefined many phenomena and also introduce in international agenda, introduce new areas, problems and topics. The topic of our panel is war in Ukraine, new geopolitical reality. And I would like to ask you, sir, what is this new geopolitical reality from the perspective of Vilnius and from Lithuania, Doctor? Welcome, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to this conference. I will try to answer what this reality, geopolitical reality is now globally after, well, in the war in Ukraine. First of all, it seems that the architecture of the security in Europe got changed, in my opinion, and Lithuania now is trying to carry out more valuable policy. Just as, you know, Lithuania is a small country, it is not able to resist all physical forces from the side of Russia, and therefore we have to implement more in this international policy. We have to implement those value components, because we know that always a bigger political player will have more to offer than a small country like Lithuania. And therefore, one of our diplomatic policy elements is to make the international policy to be more value-based. On the other hand, it is so that Lithuania is now trying to carry out the diplomatic policy so to more talk about the situation of the region and the fact that the disaster, the tragedy of Ukraine, it is not a tragedy for Ukraine only, but for the whole region. And not only it may, but it does influence the whole situation of security in our region. And consequence of losing the war in Ukraine is simply even difficult to, well, we are not willing to think of it, even not mentioning any forecasts to be made. So one of the tasks of diplomacy in Lithuania is making partners in international arena aware that international law has to be adhered to and that Ukraine must not lose, because otherwise the whole system of international law is breaking down otherwise. And what else can be said? That this diplomatic policy of Lithuania is now more strategic, not a symbolic one as it used to be so far, but more strategic one. And it is trying to consolidate all the democratic forces to the benefit of maintaining this value policy in the region, in Europe, and in North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. I think that much from me. Well, Doctor, a tool of contemporarily influencing Russian Federation are sanctions. Sanctions used as a tool to weaken or to influence on international arena. So please, how do you evaluate the so far sanctions against Russia, whether from the perspective of Lithuania we should use these sanctions more? If yes, so then in what sectors? Sanctions from Lithuanian perspectives, sanctions against Russia are efficient but not sufficient. That means we say that these sanctions must be made more stringent and how to put it, so that they more strongly influence those Russian factors. That means the Russian society, and certain number of specific individuals who are gaining profits from this and are helping the whole regime to stay in power. Now, what to do for these sanctions to be still more efficient? So, according to Lithuania, first of all, it must be a tougher control, more strict control of these sanctions, and preventing the possibility of bypassing these sanctions, so that there is no possibility to bypass these sanctions, because we know, especially at the beginning, there were lots of examples when various companies simply were managing to cope with it and successfully bypassed these sanctions. What else can be said about these sanctions? I think that Lithuania should also introduce certain sanctions, national sanctions. That means within the country. However, here are certain risks that it may be ineffective, but it requires a certain conclusion. Well, one of the examples, it may be this transit via Kaliningrad. It is a very obvious and visible factor that only and solely Lithuania is controlling this transit. Because again, in other places there is a possibility to bypass these sanctions, but the national sanctions must be very well cooperated, because concluded, on the one hand it may be more harm to Lithuania, on the other hand it may not produce a demanded result. And the third thing, just simply making partners aware within the EU in North Atlantic Treaty area that these sanctions have to be tightened, made more stringent, and so that they would influence very specifically. One of the conditions is all these bank transfers, let's say technological transfers and so on. I would like to ask about the question of both membership of Ukraine in the NATO and issues of increasing security of Lithuania. I must not avoid mentioning that we are in this group of security. I mean, we understand problems of security in our region together with Ukraine. Poland, Ukraine and Lithuania form a Lublin Triangle cooperation. We have Polish-Ukrainian Brigade in Lublin. And I would like to ask about two things. Lithuania, in a similar way as Poland, understands the problems in the region and is a supporter of membership of Ukraine in the EU and in the NATO. But as we can see, not all European countries perceive this question the same way. What steps should be made by EU member states in order to speed up this process and to convince those who are not optimists to such processes in Europe? Well, it is a very difficult question because sometimes it seems that we ourselves miss some knowledge about the political processes going on in those countries which are opposing to this process of integrating Ukraine. I think that one of the largest worries is that it may cause workforce coming to the EU, this migration on the one hand. On the other hand, that I think this agricultural sector is a sensitive matter. Well, we know that the whole system of structural funds will have to get reformed, which on the other hand means that for certain countries this amount of money coming from these funds will have to shrink. Let us add the fact that, as we can see now in the whole EU, this agricultural sector meets certain problems, so it is a problem being political of those countries themselves, and I think it is one of the most important and most serious factors which is discouraging those countries, or at least will not let them to cross a certain barrier and admit this accession of Ukraine into the EU. Nevertheless, I think that from moral perspective and value-wise, these countries are not against integrating Ukraine in the EU. But as I said, the main reasons are more of economic, political character, and I think this is this main breaking factor, in my opinion. Yes, in the first half of this year, Poland led the presidency in the EU, and the motto was security. Therefore, this security and diplomacy are strongly intertwined, and Lithuania is a small country, as you said, in a very specific geographic location. Please tell us briefly what steps in order to increase security are taken up by Lithuania to increase their security level. Well, now, like all countries bordering with this region, with Russia, Belarus, the first and most visible step is to increase the defense budget. Already in 2026, Lithuania is planning the defense budget to exceed 5%. And exactly it is, the goal is to obtain 5.38% for defense purposes. And this is a political goal put forth by all political parties. But now there is only a problem how to implement it, because sometimes certain other sectors suffer from it. So this is the first step, I would dare say. The second very obvious and visible step is this international cooperation, and specifically it is this German brigade in Lithuania, which in 2027 is to reach full battle readiness. Now intense work is in progress. Preparatory work is in progress. Roads, railways, of the trains, building the barracks, and the whole infrastructure related to it. And let me tell you, for example, that there are also school and kindergartens being built for families of those German soldiers who will come here with their families. The second thing, which seems to me be very important, maybe not so visible, it is that Lithuania is very clearly coming to total defense, that it is not only the army, but the whole society must be prepared. And here, well, in Nordic countries, the philosophy of total defense, yes, exactly. And also the mobilization system and all this concept is copied from Finland into Lithuania. So it is all based on that. What else can be said here? Well, on the other hand, now cooperation with industry got very activated. That means industry is being dragged into all the military needs. And I think everybody realized that recently we had big problems with balloons coming from Belarus. Where they were used to smuggle stuff over the border. So there is no problem. I mean, there is a problem that we do not have instruments to stop it. And now Ministry of Economics announced a contest giving 1 million euro for the prices for the local industry to work out how fighting it would be possible, because we know that the balloons are flying uncontrollably, and shooting them down, well, is not good, because the packages they are carrying weigh up to 40 kilograms. So when it falls in a wrong place, the effect may be very unpleasant. And I think last is aid for Ukraine. I cannot tell you precisely, but there is some percentage. But as far as I remember from earlier, that percentage-wise from BVP, Lithuania, like other Baltic states, allocate more for the aid for Ukraine. And recently what could be specified is the intelligence, military intelligence, and the other one, because we in Lithuania, as you know, we have a lot of those refugees from Belarus. It's within this help supporting democratic forces in those countries, in Belarus, Russia. So it is the value policy. But, well, it's well known that among those people, you come across those who came not for this purpose, let's say. And this intelligence is very, very needed here, because we had maybe not many, but a few cases that the opposition activists were beaten and so on. So here we have to strengthen our forces in this area. So military intelligence force, yes, yes. Good. So thank you very kindly. I think we have touched on a few, at least a few themes. Thanks to Mr. Doctor, we could learn the Lithuanian perspective. But let's move from Vilnius to Lublin. We have a teleport in Lithuanian Square. We can move to the University College of Entrepreneurship and Administration, WSPA. University. So we will be continuing on the themes, as Dr. Kazinas mentioned, regarding refugees, because among our speakers we have a proxy of the Voivod for foreigners in Lublin, Dr. Maria Mazur. But first, addressing Dr. Jarosław Kita, Kit, I would like to ask you about the core of diplomacy, about its effectiveness also, because as we can see, what was announced by Donald Trump, ending the war in 24 hours, then the meeting with Putin, and he said that he saw the will to end the war. Not fully he recognizes the moods of the president of Russian Federation because the peace process seems to be stuck. And everybody would like, I think there is an expectation for any changes to happen so that this war would end. But is there any chance for an effective peace process? And is there any chance for this core of diplomacy, so negotiation function, to really work? Thank you. Does the microphone work? Yes. Thank you. So here I would like to start by saying Jean-Baptiste Duhazel said about international relations in such a way that international relations are a network. When we pull one thread, the whole net starts moving. And when we are talking of some chances or threats or generally of the situation of forecasting peace in Ukraine, well, people say that in international relations you cannot forecast effectively. Yes, this is a very important theme, which I will mention, but we are talking of declarations which politicians keep talking of, yes, and there in the course of a presidential campaign, he was saying that within 1 day, 2-3 months, Trump said he would achieve peace. But we are also talking of real activities towards peace, towards how that peace could be achieved and in what way. We all understand, researchers, experts in international relations, that the policy of appeasement, I think you remember 1930s, Cuba, an attempt at feeding, like Winston Churchill said, that this appeasement is something what resembles the art of feeding a crocodile with the hope that the crocodile would finally not eat us. And what is done globally regarding Russian Federation, it resembles what was going through Munich in 1938. Such attempts at putting off this war, putting off aggression for later, attempts at surviving, maybe getting ready for this situation which may come to us and is already coming. We have drones, we have diversion in Poland, we are very close to this, all that. And in my opinion, we can be talking of peace only if the price of fighting, of war with Russian Federation in this aggression will be higher than what Russian Federation is planning now. I mean that when Russian Federation will be losing more, in this case we'll be able to talk about peace or ceasefire, but temporary one. We know what forecast is, what geopolitical, geostrategic situation is, and here we can recall a lot of events from the recent days, this Mindich Gate and a lot of other things, recent meetings of Witkov, of peace dimensions, signing by the head of Ukraine treaty, a ceasefire between Russia and, well, here we should focus on this. I'm of good hope because, in my opinion, the military power of Ukraine is highly undervalued at this moment. I am personally in touch with Ukrainian military, people who are now fighting. Among them, I have lots of friends, and I know how Ukrainian army has changed over the recent 10 years, and it has changed a lot. In 2015, I was doing analysis about military forces of Ukraine, and at that time, the situation was real tough, horrible. But now we have a power which manages to withhold one of the largest armies in this world, Russian Federation. So this is how I tried to answer your question. And does Ukraine have any plan B? How do you evaluate activities by Ukrainian diplomacy? Because we remember that unlucky meeting in the White House, and we know that the attitude of American president is not fully foreseeable. His policy towards Europe, not only to Ukraine, but also towards Europe, is also unforeseeable. He gives signals that the support will be smaller, weaker. Does Ukraine have any plan B when that aid from US is shrinking? In my opinion, well, I'm watching the diplomatic policy of Ukraine. I have been doing it for 25 years. I remember well all general consulars in Lublin. I knew some of them in person, also ambassadors. A week ago, I was at the Embassy of Ukraine, and I had meetings with very positive impressions regarding change of quality in Ukrainian diplomatic corps. Fortunately, at last, in the recent 5 years, we have a group of diplomats, patriots, who are working, first of all, for the Ukrainian state. And this is very interesting and important part of development of diplomatic corps, and generally speaking, Ukrainian democracy. Plan B. Now it's difficult to say that something exists when above the head of Ukraine there are some plans, some signings. When now representatives of Pentagon, Vitkov, are going to Kiev and are going and talking about Ukraine to finally, in the nearest future, to give up Donetsk, Luhansk, and in the clash when we are talking about civilization concepts here, we also recently talk that Ukraine should introduce Russian language as the second language in education. So all requirements. So it is actually ceasefire on Russian terms. And why is it happening like this? How can well-educated diplomacy can fight if there is Mindigate and if there is what is happening now when on the 10th of November, 1 kilometer from here, Timur Mindic is going via Lublin to Warsaw by car to the hotel. Therefore, we are in international relations circles, we are touching on all that. He is driving to Warsaw, and we witness actually similar situation like the one in the year 2000, tapes of Melnichenko. I think you remember. It was similar. At that time, President Kuchma ordered to destroy journalist Gongadze, and Russian Federation gets involved in the situation, helps and discredits the tapes of Melnichenko and demand Yanukovych to be nominated prime minister for the first time. Viktor Medvedchuk, actually later mate of Putin, is becoming head of Kuchma's administration. The same is happening now. So convenience through that event is by all means actually feasible. So the negotiations will be going towards dragging the net towards the Russian Federation more. Yes, you touched on a problem, a situation which over the recent days actually circled the world about the terrible problem very close to Ukrainian president. And the question, won't it question the authority of President Zelensky in the eyes of Western leaders, and won't it be translated to weakening the support from other countries, the aid directed to Ukraine from other countries, European countries? Well, I partly answered this question already, because in very short term perspective, it will be a very negative image of both the president and his administration, which was earlier announced, because we know that President Trump's administration do not very much want to see Mr. Yermak, head of Zelensky's administration, on their territory, and they know that there are actually problems, and that the situation which we have had was not detected by journalists, investigation journalists, but by NABU, by state services. Those bodies, the task of which is to act in fighting corruption. I expect, well, the whole world coalition of the willing ones is expecting to have all legal steps fulfilled in order to act towards avoiding the situation to be repeated. And in my opinion, in diplomatic context, it is something which is very negative. And on the other hand, we can see Zelensky's activities, meeting with Macron, and well, yesterday he was in Turkey looking for support. Yes, he's traveling. He's not stopping his initiatives, actually. Administration of President of Ukraine is not stopping activities. It is also a positive thing. But I wanted to introduce you to that we are not talking of this aggression of the situation which currently is in Ukraine from this perspective, that for 4 years or for 3 years war is in progress, or 10 years. So first attempt, I wanted to remind the students here, the first attempt was in November 1991, when the Russian Federation already then wanted to aggressively act, but we remember what happened then, how many strategic warheads, nuclear warheads in Ukraine, and then, well, actually, so the year 2014, all what is happening, because I took this theme because recently there was an excellent interview with Norman Davis that Europe is underestimating, and Europe and the whole world do not know what is happening in the East. This is a gap in the knowledge, a huge gap. We have to go through that gap of knowledge and to show the whole world that all these events and corruption is something completely different. You have to view it different than if something like that happened in Poland or in Germany, and a completely different vision would be if we look at a country fighting in Ukraine in this current situation. But for sure, there is no tolerance for such activities, because countries direct their support. They expect greater transparency, greater responsibility. You mentioned in your earlier input that there is a radical change in quality of diplomatic Ukrainian services, that these are true patriots, but diplomacy is also studied from the perspective of its effectiveness. Is there a chance, in your opinion, for any peace to be negotiated with Russia in the current situation, or not? Peace, to negotiate peace with Russia? No. In my opinion, there is no chance for it. objectively speaking, somebody must win in this war. It would be good if, with the support of the whole world, democratic world, Ukraine would win. It will be worse if there is one leader, Eurasian, Russia, China. You remember Brzezinski in 1970s, he was telling us that the worst for the whole world would be Eurasia ruled by one power. Without failure of Russia, without recognizing that for them this war is inconvenient, non-strategic, not to be won, well, ceasefire will only be a short-term thing. 2, 3, 5 years, we know that Putin plans to live until the age of 90. Thanks to the latest technologies, everybody keep talking of it, and his child is planned to be the future, I guess, leader. But we remember that authoritarian regimes are operating in a completely different zone than the democratic ones. Without failure of Russia, without permanent peace is not achievable. Lack of peace is bad information for Ukraine, because the country will be in a frozen conflict all the time, which is not positive, and it closes its path to the NATO and to the EU. Thank you very much. From this macro perspective, I would like to move over to micro perspective, so to what changes the war in Ukraine brought to our region also. Dr. Maria Mazur is with us, who is proxy of Lublin Voivod for foreigners. We remember February 2022. We remember that huge wave of refugees from Ukraine, the wave caused by war, of course, because people who wanted to save themselves, their children, so they were leaving. And we remember that it was a burst of bottom-up initiatives. Each of us were helping whatever way, and we were able to receive the citizens of Ukraine because synergy of the society and system took place. But from the perspective of 3 years, what are, in your opinion, the challenges regarding integration of foreigners? What problems were at that time? What conclusions we drew at that time? What was the lesson we had, and were there challenges in integration, and did we succeed in overcoming problems which occurred at that time? I think now you can hear me. A very, very warm welcome at today's conference and at today's debate. Madam Doctor, thank you very much for all these questions prepared on my side. I would like to first of all, thank the organizer, the staff of Regional Center of International Debate, because it is the third event of this kind, and one was held in Chełm. The first one was held in Janów Lubelski. Then, not so long ago, we were in Chełm and Janów Lubelski, and now in WSPA in Lublin. And I'm very glad that students of international relations are participating in this event. Madam Doctor, I will actually take the opportunity to refer to the input by my predecessors and also start from the level, the global level, this macro level, and go deeper down to the local level. On my side, I would like to highlight that if we are talking of, it was quite rightly stated, Professor, thank you, coalition of the willing or unwilling ones. So at the local level, if we talk of the coalition of the willing and unwilling, we are rather, as University College of Entrepreneurship and Administration, we are on the side of organizations which are willing, because from the very beginning, from the beginning of full-scale war in Ukraine, as university, we are in solidarity with Ukrainian nation. And we have been helping them, we are and we will be. The reason is simple. We have been doing it for many, many years because we are after our neighbor to have these European values in them and to have Ukrainians feeling closer to the EU rather than to the neighbor Mr. Doctor talked a lot about. But I think how the war will end, of course, here I wish Ukrainians and us too for the victory to be at the side of a democratic state, but Russia is extremely consequent, and these rules and their imperial colonial policy, both of Tsar's Russia and contemporary Russia, is simply without any change. It is written down in school books. Children in Russian Federation keep learning it from day one. So the goal is for this to be a big, great Russian country. So this is about geographic dimension, large from geographic perspective, territorial perspective. But this war is a completely different war, not the war about which we read from Second World War school books where people took Kalashnikov. No, these are hybrid wars, and of course our society is being tested actually from August 2021. That means from the first crisis which happened in Polish-Belarusian border. Of course, the question of migration is playing a key role, and the point is to actually make us, local people, quarreling with people who came to us from Ukraine or earlier as war refugees. Well, earlier we knew the term, but it came from the international protection. So for us, refugees are people who file an application very often on the border, applying for international protection. But once the war broke out, if we come to that moment, 2022, well, nobody was ready for such situation. Nobody were ready that in the first year from the war began, 3.2 million people would cross our Polish-Ukrainian border, that in first 3 months from the outburst of war in Ukraine, here in Lublin, a small town, 1,200,000 people will stop for at least one night. Our geographic location, if we are talking of Lublin region, is difficult really, because we have two borders. We have the border just behind which one the war is going on, but we also in the phase of hybrid war we still are. We can see those elements related to the breach of our airspace, drones. We know what happened this week, how those people who come to us and the situation of those people is being utilized in order to obtain information about our critical infrastructure or to events which happened this week. That means related to railway. And well, it was really very close to a possible great disaster happening. I take this opportunity repeating to the students. Students have to be working and studying, so they have to combine these two things together, and very often they are in a situation that they are looking for jobs. They are looking often on the telegram, and very often they come across an announcement that you have to come to point A, send your photo, and we get some remuneration, and they do not realize that they may be participating in this type of incidents where they will be utilized by Russian Federation to pass on more information about our infrastructure. Well, say critical at least. And the same was happening on Polish-Belarusian border. I was going to centers, open and closed centers, and very often people who have their legalized stay in Poland, they were used in order to transfer those people. That means refugees who were illegally crossing the border. So those people are being used in these processes. But back to 2022, there was no system. Let's keep in mind that at that time Poland was an emigration country, a country from which people were emigrating, and all of a sudden well, over 2-year period, Poland became an immigration country to which people were coming, country receiving people from abroad. Initially, practically, there was no system in place because nobody was ready for receiving those people, and number of which would be over 3 million. So all these processes, mechanisms had to be created absolutely from scratch. Let me remind, well, here, entering the statistics, of course, Lublin area or Lublin city, here we became a place of relocation. So very often those people were coming here, spending up to a week and then going on further to other European countries. Initially, I was asking myself a question, well, because I saw a sea of people. Where those people going? If those people going to Spain or Germany were really getting to a good place and getting the help on time, of course, in my head I had all the processes related to human trafficking. Let's remember that when the border was open and those drivers who were receiving those people those people were going, there were no mechanisms in place. If we talk of infrastructure, the places for group residencing, we had 263 places of group accommodation, about 67,000 people staying in some group accommodation places. But these are not all refugees from Ukraine, because partly these are people who have rented a flat, or earlier they were in touch with Poland and they found it easier to actually find themselves in this situation. We were all helping. Nobody was teaching us how to help wisely, how to support, but also how to support to avoid getting harmed. Nobody was teaching us a method of a chain that you can be passing on those people or families so that the system of the family is not overloaded. A lot is being talked about Poles, but students or people who worked in Poland earlier were also receiving their families. So without earlier presence of the migrants, I'm not talking of Ukrainians, because actually not only Ukrainians, but Belarusians were helping, and people from Central Asia. Not everybody had to, but people who are actually providing humanitarian aid or integration realize that together with this humanitarian aid, the process of integration must start, which you, Madam Doctor, are asking about. So it is not enough to provide the basic needs, but we also realize that those children in a moment would go to school, and at schools the integration should go on in a correct way. Otherwise, nationality conflicts would arise. We realize that jobs needed to be created, and it needs to be working with such entrepreneurs. Well, let me tell you one thing, we can complain about our state system, integration policy, nothing working, but the Prime Minister will not come to a given organization, institution, and will not bring the processes in order. So I think that every leader in every organization should take up the burden. If they are employing or receiving a person from abroad, should take it up on their own shoulders and bring certain processes in order. No, everything is in order. We still are within time. So is helping actually flowing in the veins of, in the blood of our citizens, being part of the policy of the system of the region? Or how do you evaluate it from the perspective of 3 years? Yes, initially we were all helping. So what does it look like after that time, after the war started, and how many refugees stayed in Lublin or in our region? As I started from the places of group accommodation, so today in group accommodation places in Lublin region, we have 1,500 people. In their majority, these are people who will not be able to become independent due to their age or being handicapped. So this is the situation we have. And this means that if initially we had about 67,000 those people in group accommodation places, and today we have 1,500, so we did our utmost for those people to become independent and to become inhabitants of our small but also large towns. Well, the places, about 90% refugees from Ukraine are people who came in the first half year. That means after the war broke out. So they have been here for 3 years already. And regarding the scale of help, now there is no need for this. But if that number of group accommodation places will shrink or the aid will shrink, it doesn't mean that when in Ukraine we know the infrastructural critical infrastructure is being bombarded. Well, I don't like the word wave, but if we have a crisis, a migration crisis again, all these points, all those processes will be recovered, reconstructed. So it is not so that group accommodation place is liquidated. No, we suspend it. And in regional office, we perfectly well know this infrastructure, and we know which places of group accommodation or reception points will be launched within 24, 48 or 72 hours will be launched. But at the moment, there is no such need. And of course, social mood happens to be completely different. Leftist parties are doing their job too. Language of hate is emerging. We also can see how Russian Federation is working in the network, that there are accounts opened up recently with no history and so on, and from those accounts various comments are being written. Well, pro-Putin, pro-Russian comments, but also anti-Ukrainian. So also with such activity, Russian Federation aims at quarreling us and dividing us here. Well, actually, utilizing the incident in the railway is an example of it because it influenced our awareness, because in the thoughts of an average Pole, yes, we are helping, and here such incidents. So, yes, we know you mentioned several studies, so it is tiredness with war, and in what areas do these tensions appear, and how can we overcome them? Yes, really, tensions appear, but I believe that we are currently in a completely different moment if it comes to tensions, and we take into account schools, because many children attend Polish schools, and well, 800 plus was actually made dependent on children being at school. We actually faced a situation that a child was actually going to 2 schools. Parents wanted it to be both Polish and Ukrainian school. Schools have learned, and from the very beginning, I remember the first group of teachers who came. Those people needed to be quickly taught Polish so that they could enter Polish schools and play the role of intercultural assistant. And let me tell you, from Lublin district and from Lublin city, the whole system was actually transferred to national level. So I'm very glad. In schools, there are people who are a liaison, but they also know how to react in such situations. Another question is activities by NGOs, because they played a key role. So where the system did not work, where there was so-called gap, the gap was actually being patched up by NGOs. NGOs also, regarding matters related to intolerance and discrimination, they are supporting here. But I think regarding organization, well, everybody got aware that these processes need to be kept in control and they need to be responded at. Silence is not allowed, because silence is a kind of approval. So when we see aggression and intolerance in words, our duty is to react correctly and without being silent. So NGOs have their tools and their methods, and here they support regarding schools by all means, but taking into account Lublin, but also Lublin district, this multiculturality is typical of us for many centuries. So Lublin has always been at the contact point of cultures. Let me tell you an interesting point. Recently, I was visited by a colleague from Turkey, and I met him in town, and he said, Maria, but look, I am walking Krakowskie Przedmieście, and somebody is coming up to me and asking me the way. So what disturbs you? Do I look a local person to be asked about the way? So it is written in. If we look at strategy of city of Lublin 2030, so this multiculturality is playing a key role. So these processes, which in my opinion are more visible in other districts here, we have actually took those processes better in control. For sure, and also not insignificant for the climate of Polish-Ukrainian relations is what is happening at the national level, the presidential campaign, and utilizing the narration which is happening here. It also resonates for sure. But are there any solutions, systemic solutions, which could actually lift the burden of local governments in the area of supporting foreigners, or is it done by NGOs, colloquially speaking? Well, let me mention one program. This is Together to Independence. It is a governmental program, but it was implemented by Polish Red Cross. And really, we were traveling the region to absolutely various towns, encouraging for various options related to entering job market. So programs of this type do exist, but regarding intercultural assistance, a lot has changed in this respect. Migration strategy has been elaborated, whereas regarding migration strategy or integration strategy, it is very, very dependent on local conditions. These policies must not be translated directly from other countries because it worked somewhere. Nevertheless, we have difficult conditions, and I mentioned upfront two different difficult borders. These characteristics is influencing it too, in my opinion. Honorable ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Madam Doctor. Well, we have touched on in our panel, war in Ukraine, new geopolitical reality of Europe, Central Eastern Europe. We have touched on many themes, many topics. Thanks to Dr. Gediminas Kazenas from University in Vilnius, thanks to Dr. Kubica, who shared his experience in economic cooperation, and my guests here. We talked also about opportunities for peace and problems which also affected us directly related to war in Ukraine. We still have 15 minutes left, and I would like to devote this time to possible questions for our speakers to answer, and I do hope for a vivid discussion in this area. Well, are Karol and Gediminas with us? Karol, yes, I am. Karol, can you hear us? Yes, I can. Thank you very much. I have a question addressing Mr. Karol Kubica, because I read a book by Thomas Foro, the sirens singing. He gave information that competitors actually inform the Russians about location of a given company, and then those companies are then bombarded by rockets or drones. Do you happen to get such information that such things do happen? Because you mentioned Sambord, and I thought of it about Fakro window factory. It is not a typical military target, so why did Russians bombard those factories? Well, unfortunately, in Ukraine, there are still many Russian spies and watchers who deliver information to Russia about the location of various plants. where humanitarian aid is kept, because often in the Polish companies or companies, Ukrainian companies, aid is actually kept by warehouses being given for storage facilities for humanitarian aid, and then such rockets unfortunately hit those buildings. I have a question for Dr. Gediminas Kazanas to answer, because yesterday I talked to a journalist who told me that he talked to one of his acquaintances who has a business in Baltic states, and I hear that more and more often a situation happens that international business is withdrawing from Baltic states. Is it true? Do you see such a situation? Or is it just media speculation that somehow feeling this growing threat, this business starts actually bypassing Baltic states? Yes, this problem is to some extent, maybe not so sharply as in the question that the business is withdrawing actively. No. I have not heard of active withdrawal. Maybe one or two companies withdrew, but we don't know if it was the reason. But on the other hand, I would like to highlight that some large companies are coming. We can specify, maybe I did not mention in my first input, that a German company, Rheinmetall, came to Lithuania and already started actively to build a new factory. So, on the other hand, we hear that, and especially the tourist sector suffers most from it. So, on the one hand, that tourists are actually bypassing this. It was noted especially in Klaipėda, where the cruise ships come less often. So that phase was at the very beginning. Now again it starts, being forgotten. But recently the balloons which were disturbing the operation of Vilnius airport, they had a reason that tourists started canceling hotel orders in Vilnius. So it is not an ungrounded thing. Maybe some companies simply hesitate with investment, but for active withdrawal from Lithuania, I couldn't confirm it. Well, maybe anybody else? Dr. Andrzej Sołaciuk. I have a question to Dr. Gediminas Kazanas. Well, there is a next peace plan, and it is extremely unfavorable for Ukraine. How would Lithuania react if such plan was being pushed forth by the US? Is it acceptable for Russian politicians such a situation that Ukraine must give up some territory, reduce the army, and make steps towards the Russian Federation? And another question to Maria Mazur. Well, because tracking the information about aid to refugees, I think our town is not boasting about it. I don't see publications and projects to show it, because when I read literature about the situation in Ukraine, everybody say yes, a lot was happening in Poland, but they talk about Slovakia, Romania, and there are no publications about Poland to show what was happening in border crossing points and in the towns like Lublin, Rzeszów, and so on. wouldn't it be worthwhile to think of a project or to elaborate a publication which would actually show off, to be a way to boast about what Poland did to help the Ukrainians, and especially to make it in English, because I see these publications are missing. Thank you. Yes, let me ask Dr. Gediminas to answer the question by Dr. Andrzej Szabaciuk. Well, I think that it is when there was a clear negative response, because, as we said, our goal of foreign policy diplomacy is victory by Ukraine, because only this can strategically guarantee security of the whole region. If Ukraine will have to accept such terms, it will be bad. It will simply be bad. But I think as long as the last dot has not been placed, I think now it has to be the goal for our diplomacy to act, especially with the Atlantic, not to talk with the Congress members, with the Senate and the President's advisors to avoid this happening. So we will see, but response from Lithuania will definitely be negative. Thank you very much. And Madam Doctor, ad vocem. Well, Doctor, I thank you very, very much, and I do agree that such publications, especially in English, are missing, that we talk too little about it. And recently I talked to the city office about strategy and asked about the diploma thesis. So I'm addressing the academia and people who run seminars. I think it is worthwhile to make students write it, or it may be paper by some of us. Well, these publications are missing because most people are waiting for the end of war in Ukraine, for the publication to be from a subject point perspective to be complete. So a certain process must be there, but regarding beginnings, in Lublin itself, for the first 3 months, 1.2 million people, Lublin Social Committee to Help Ukraine was established then, and it was a social bottom-up movement, and none of us had a stamp or position. Nobody was a president here, so people just gathered here at Powiaków 12 and culture center, so various units, psychological help, drivers, group accommodation centers, coordinators. So the system was created bottom-up by citizens of Lublin with great proportion share of the migrating community. And we managed, because regarding the state system or local governments in the city of Lublin coping with that big migration crisis otherwise would not be possible. Honorable ladies and gentlemen, there is one more question, if I may, addressing Dr. Karol Kubica. Do you have a knowledge, because Russia destroyed at least 2 Polish plants, one Fakro and in July this year, Babinka. So do you have the knowledge if Polish state would demand damages, liquidated damages from Russia for those destroyed factories? Karol, have you heard? Yes, I can hear. Do you hear me? Yes? Hello, hello? Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, I got connected. Well, actually, we had a blackout. I am on EcoFlow, so there may be problems with internet. So I don't have such information. I know that these plants addressed Ministry of Development and Technology for support, and here are some funds actually released. Preferential loans for reconstruction of Polish investment projects. So it is 10 million for 10 years on 2% interest. Thank you. Honorable ladies and gentlemen, thank you very kindly. I'm glad that we also had questions from the audience. Thank you, Carol, for your participation, and you, Doctor, also thanks, and Debo for being with us, and thanks to my speakers here, panelists, Madam Doctor, Mr. Doctor, and all of you. And now I think it's time for a brief break. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. The moderator thanked the panelists. Thank you for efficiently running the panel. And coffee break until 12:30. Please meet at the hall. And at 12:30, discussion panel number 2. Yes, everybody are back, not all. The panel moderator is still missing. Let's wait a moment. May I pick any seat? Good. Ladies and gentlemen, well, to stay within the timeline, let's move on to the next part, the second panel, and the last one. So far, we oscillated around matters closer to our border. Now let's go a little bit further. And the title of the discussion panel, Inflammatory Middle East, Taiwan and Other Focuses of Tensions, Implications for International Security and Security of Europe. Panel will be moderated by Professor Tomasz Stępniewski, who already had the opportunity to moderate the first discussion in the first part, and now we have our guests who will share their knowledge and experience. So let me welcome the guests now. Dr. Norbert Obara, lecturer at WSPA at International Relations, course of studies online. Dr. Alexei Pulecki, George Washington University, lecturer of Catholic University of Lublin, and locally Dr. Konrad Zasztoft, Academic Center of Strategic Analysis, Academy of War Arms, Academy of War Art, now Warsaw University. Please moderate the panel. We have about 90 minutes available. Thank you very much, Mr. Chancellor, for introduction and for introducing our guests. And the formula will be such that we will have 2 rounds of questions. The first round will be one more diagnosing the situation, the other one more related to challenges and prospects regarding broadly understood Middle East. So the first question addressed at Dr. Konrad Zasztoft, that means role of Turkey, Syria and Gaza. In the first panel we heard a lot about the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, and it is a conflict involving us very strongly and affecting us as well. And if you look from the perspective of Western Europe, now we hear more about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is destabilizing situation in the Middle East. And now the question, because Dr. Zasztoft is a specialist in Turkey, first of all, and Middle Eastern subject. So it's about the role of Turkey, because Turkey is running a neo-Ottoman policy, getting involved in Libya, Caucasus, and Black Sea area. So the question, how does this involvement of Turkey influences the involvement of the NATO and position of the alliance in confrontation with the Russian Federation? Is the attitude of Turkey a strengthening element or the one complicating unity and Euro-Atlantic strategy? Welcome, sir. The floor is yours. So thank you very much for this interesting question. And first of all, thank you for invitation to this conference. And I would dare say that this question is asked, well, one might consider what North Atlantic Treaty has to do with the situation in the Middle East, because generally it is, of course, an area which, since the Second World War, well, the U.S. Were playing a great role there regarding the Middle East, and of course Israel, Turkey as allies to the U.S., especially Israel, but Turkey also. But the NATO itself, the task of the NATO is to defend the territories of the members of the alliance, and regarding the Middle East, it's only Turkey, or partly Turkey, as a partly Middle Eastern country, may be actually included in consideration of this region. But the question is up to date by all means, because events in the Middle East are of great importance also for security of the members of the alliance, and especially, I mean, the eastern flank. I mean Poland too. Countries on the east of the NATO which struggle to greatest extent with a threat from Russian Federation policy due to aggression of Russia in Ukraine. But somebody may ask, yes, but what does it have in common with Gaza? Because we are to talk about Gaza Strip and the Middle East and Syria. Well, maybe before I answer this question, let me start from the fact that Turkey really played a very significant role in concluding in the ceasefire in Gaza. Why? Because in this jigsaw puzzle in the Middle East, highly complex, it appeared that Turkey at a certain moment had tools available to negotiate with Hamas, to negotiate successfully. This is also related to the growing position of Turkey in the Middle East, especially in Syria, in the fact of changed regime in Syria. The government, the rule of Al-Sharif in Damascus is a government clearly friendly to Turkey, who came into power with great support from Turkey, and here they must display gratitude to Turkey. But regarding Gaza Strip, Turkey, well, the source of Turkey is effective, highly effective diplomacy. So Turkey was actually capable of convincing a number of states who are playing the role in relation to, or they are in touch with Hamas regarding future of Gaza Strip, these being Egypt, but also Qatar. Qatar is a very important country because it is an extremely rich country, which at the same time has had and does have very strict political links, personal ideological links with Hamas, and it appears to have also very good relations with Turkey. Qatar is one of, if not the nearest to Turkey, a state in the Gulf state countries, and it is actually a piggy bank of Turkey, because Turkey, being in crisis, is not readily using Qatar investment, but here they may convince Qatar to invest in other parts of the Middle East, not only in the Middle East, because, for example, convincing Egypt to get involved in the peace process in Gaza is also related to the fact that Turkey may do mediation between Qatar and Egypt to attract investment from Qatar to Egypt. So ending, Turkey played a huge, vast role regarding the ceasefire. And a main role was played by the U.S., of course, but the U.S., based on outsourcing, used Turkey as their ally to actually solve really many things within this process. And now moving on to what I started from, is it of some importance for the NATO? Because we are talking of the NATO here. Yes, of course, especially it is important because Turkey over the recent years has been through a period of crisis in relations with their allies, especially with the US. Now it has changed during the second presidentship of Trump, and what has changed, we do not have Assad regime in Syria, which means the role of Russia actually got weakened. Consider Russia stopped being a force of influence in the Middle East. And anyway, for Turkey, the pain in the neck related to Assad's regime is gone, and with what is going on in Syria, now they have a friendly regime there, and now Turkey can focus on other regions which have been less important so far. And here I mean the Black Sea region. So on the one hand, we have Turkey coming closer to the US and other allies from the NATO. with whom they had crises over the recent years, and significant end of problems on the southern flank of the NATO or southern border of Turkey. And now Turkey can be more active here regarding policy related to war in Ukraine. And I think this now is visible. Well, a sign that Turkey wants to cooperate closer with the West is the shrinking energy cooperation with Russia. Turkey, for years, for decades, actually has been dependent from gas coming through pipelines from Russia. The gas is still flowing, but its share is lesser and lesser. Turkey decided to buy LNG from the US now. And also in internal debate in Turkey, we can see greater awareness of the problems of the eastern flank in Turkey. So far, they were saying that we are the southern flank of the alliance. In Turkey now, we can hear that we are also the eastern flank of the alliance. Yes, thank you very much. Well, we can joke that if we have eastern, southern, northern flank, so where is this real alliance? But it is just an anecdote. But you quite rightly mentioned that as a result of a changed regime in Syria, Turkey got rid of a problem in some way, because this presence of Russia in Syria and in the Black Sea after annexation of Crimea was changing geostrategic position of Turkey and gave them a pain in the head. But now the situation got solved to the benefit of Turkey, really. And now going on the topic of Gaza Strip conflict, addressing Dr. Obara, war in Gaza is over-regional because it involves the Iranian resistance axis, and it destabilizes the sea routes. So does the current conflict signal the beginning of new international rivalry, broader proxy war in the Middle East with direct participation of the powers? How do you diagnose the situation regarding that conflict in Gaza Strip? Thank you very much for invitation and possibility to talk here at my university. This year changed considerably the situation in the Middle East, and also change the scale or determining who is the power in the region, because still within this year, at the beginning of this year, Islamic Republic of Iran had this ambition, but now we can say that Iran stopped being a regional power. It is a year of disaster for the Republic of Iran, and actually the fact that the system survived is, well, so following what you've said, the concept of foreign policy of Iran was based on forming a ring of fire around Israel. The ring of fire was based on the fact that Iran was supporting groups which were to all the time absorb the politics of Israel. It was Lebanon, Hezbollah, Syria, Assad regime, and Hamas in Palestine. Well, ladies and gentlemen, nothing remained of it. Maybe it's an exaggeration, because Hezbollah has not quit yet, but it got weaker considerably. Every war weakens all parties, not only the entity which is being attacked, but also the attacker. Israel, as a result of aggression of Hamas in Palestine on their state, carried out a lot of activities, both diplomatically and militarily, which destroyed the main rival and the main enemy of Israel in the Middle East and globally. That means Islamic Republic of Iran. The essence of this was a 12-day war this year, which led to aggression of both parties, Israel on Iran and Iran on Israel. But if it was not for Trump's intervention, the Islamic Republic of Iran might collapse as a system. First, the network of Hezbollah was liquidated. The main entity, which was most sponsored by Islamic Republic of Iran in Lebanon, watching the north of Israel all the time. Then regime of Assad collapsed, which was supported by Iran, and then as a result of highly assertive military aggression, we might say, also including covering the civilians, in response of Israel to the attack of Hamas, that military stream was liquidated because the political one still exists. So this year, a considerable change of the system of powers in the Middle East got changed. We may say that one leader emerged, and it is Israel. But as I mentioned, this war weakened the country very much, also internally, because it is a highly polarized nation. But first of all, externally, because Israel is very highly being criticized globally, first of all, for their policy towards the civilians in Gaza Strip. Well, not mentioning the increasing anti-Jewish sentiments globally, practically. So war in Gaza influenced the geopolitical situation and the regional situation, not only in the Middle East, but also in Asia. Iran, we might ask if Iran could avoid helping Ukraine, but as Iran is most affected country by economic sanctions in history of sanctions, second country like this is Ukraine. So there was only one possibility, one opportunity in 2015 for Islamic Republic of Iran to get involved in the international relations stream, in international trade. It was joint comprehension plan of action when, as a result of agreement concluded by the EU, Germany, France, the UK, and the US, most sanctions, economic sanctions, have been relieved of Iran. And in return for this, Iran was supposed to stop enriching uranium. Of course, this was assumed with great joy by the whole society of Iran, because it would enable accumulation of capital and getting out of economic isolation. But nevertheless, diagnosis of both Israel and the US was that this accumulation of capital will be devoted to enriching the axis of resistance, so proxy wars of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Assad. This was the main motive that Donald Trump broke this agreement. And then what choice Iran had? They had Russian Federation as an ally, which after aggression on Ukraine was also searching for, and they are also in isolation, both economically and diplomatically, and they were looking for a partner. So Iran, wishing to obtain capital, started exporting drones, first of all, but also people who were helping in building factories, factories of drones in Russian Federation. The second partner Iran was searching for after that anti-nuclear agreement was broken have been China. Currently, about 80% of exports of hydrocarbons, because we have to remind that Iran is among 5 main countries having largest deposits of gas and number 4 in oil. Counting how much they have and can process. But China, due to their gigantic economic growth, they need these sources of energy. 80% of exports from Islamic Republic of Iran is going to China. And this is also happening through this famous fleet of shadows. That means teapots, ships without a flag. And this is also an element of change in global international relations also, because the Chinese still actually take care of the opinion of the US. But in case of the war with Taiwan, I think that this export of hydrocarbons from Iran would be completely open. And here, and next element of global relations, diplomatic, group, Kring, China, Russia, Iran and North Korea, such a group will emerge. This is a group which is against the collective West, which, back to the question, played, with the exception of the US, of course, played a tiny role regarding situation in Gaza Strip. The main role, and the only one practically, from the Western world was played by the US and first of all by Donald Trump. If it was not for the policy of Donald Trump and his ambitions to, at that time, possibly to obtain a Nobel Prize, we would still be facing the destruction of Gaza Strip and possible victory of Israel, which would actually be a transfer of the inhabitants, and in Iran overturning Islamic Republic, including killing the president and the top leader, because Israeli services perfectly well penetrate the territory of Iran. Iranian sources themselves specify that during this 12-day war, about 400 very important people were liquidated in Iran, died in Iran, both from intelligence, scientists involved in nuclear weapons, and from IRGC, the army working abroad for Islamic Republic of Iran, and the whole general staff of the army. And Iran was on the verge of a collapse. It was Trump's policy which forced Israel to stop war in Gaza Strip and the war, further aggression on Islamic Republic of Iran. And today's perspective, what will go on in Gaza Strip, depends first of all on to what extent Donald Trump's policy will be assertive. He is the only leader Israel actually takes care of his opinion. Thank you very much, Doctor, for this perspective on conflict in Gaza Strip, but also over regional consequences, because we have to remember that many countries are interested in solving or in destabilizing situation in the Middle East, and therefore here we have to have this broader perspective. And now addressing Dr. Alexei Pilecki, because this Ukrainian-Russian conflict is very carefully watched by Chinese People's Republic, who are, of course, supporting Russian Federation, because we may ask a question or pose an opinion that without support from Chinese People's Republic, Russia would not be doing so well in the conflict with Ukraine. Ukraine, in turn, being supported by the West. So the question is about Taiwan Straits, because you several times were actually in Taiwan and on grants, and you had an opportunity to watch directly the situation. You lived in that part of the world, and it's about the new front of rivalry, the US-China. So the question is whether support of the West granted to Ukraine results in China taking careful attitude to forcefully solving the problem of Taiwan, or if China took a strategy of waiting and observation, watching the hybrid war and economic confrontation, as I mentioned, by supporting Russia, which actually is fighting against the collective West. How do you see the perspective of this Taiwan Straits? A very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my opinions. Of course, China watch very carefully the war on the territory of Ukraine and are drawing their conclusions. And of course, Taiwan is for them of key importance as a reference point. in potential conflict. And here are at least 3 dimensions I would like to specify regarding the potential conflict in Taiwan. So there is a question of Taiwan itself, its role, its fate, and its meaning for global economy and for individual countries. Next is rather a layer as a case study. So Taiwan is rather very carefully being watched a moment related to the obligations of the U.S. to their allies. And here the question of Taiwan is directly influencing safety of neighboring countries, neighboring to China, and also countries like Japan, Philippines, and similar, which traditionally were actually subject to the security assured by the U.S. Now they are watching very carefully Trump's policy, because here are themes, well, the U.S. will be able to and will want to fulfill their alliance functions. And the main point is rivalry between China and the U.S., where looking at Taiwan from China is of key importance. And here, if we are talking of China, we have to keep in mind the fact that China are obsessed about sovereignty, and this results from strategic culture as well as from the experience of this century of shame, as they call it in China very often, that China must provide sovereignty for themselves. And sovereignty means as taking certain decisions internally. And here China constantly keep repeating that Taiwan is not an international case. Taiwan is only an internal Chinese matter. On the one hand, this situation is geopolitical, where Taiwan is a key point, starting point for China to go out into the world. And here Taiwan is in the center of part of those if we look at the map, well, from Japanese islands via Okinawa, Taiwan, and further islands like the Philippines and others, which are actually under control of the U.S. and their allies. And from this perspective, development of China in the 21st century undoubtedly is related to the possibility to provide access of this kind and security of access to the ocean by China. And here Taiwan is a key point. So China cannot give up this at the level of internal policy, because this is a point which keeps repeating itself in all doctrines, in all speeches of every Chinese leader. And on the one hand, from geostrategic perspective, because, for example, this great project of development of the strip and route in the 21st century, China put stakes on development of the sea part of this track and route. They have a project for the 21st century, the maritime, the sea route and strip. And now there is the necessity to provide security of access to the ocean. But on the one hand, in my opinion, from also these, development with the Taiwanese, with the experts. When I talked to the experts, Taiwanese, in Taiwan, actually since 2022, they are more worried. Compared to my earlier experience, the Taiwanese had been more optimistic. Now they are already in doubt about their future. But on the other hand, generally, if we look at the situation from a rational perspective, then China would rather put stakes on long-term form of conquering Taiwan. Because military invasion on Taiwan, well, it is a great question mark, because price of this adventure could be too high. And not mentioning the fact that Chinese army, for example, generally are not experienced in participating in real wars. From 1970s, the war in Vietnam, and conquering even such a smaller country, but an island, also quite well, relatively well armed. It is not an easy task. On the one hand, there is a question about costs at the level of economy, international response, and this is the main point of testing to what extent the world is ready to stopping China, to what extent the US will be playing their role and fulfilling their obligations. And I am of the opinion, rather, that China will be influencing Taiwan. And here we can see strategy which is in place for years, reducing the possibility for Taiwan to be active internationally, both at diplomatic, political, but also economic area. And there is also quite a lot of paths of influence on internal policy. China, yes, really act very actively in what we can name hybrid war. That means there is a pressure on business, Taiwanese business, which is related to China. And there are attempts at bribing. Well, for example, they have programs which give an opportunity for young Taiwanese to open up companies on preferential terms in China, students and alike. So there are many reports about corruption, which somehow the Taiwanese elites, China is trying to bribe them, and generally exerting pressure on Taiwan, especially that economic situation in Taiwan is worsening a bit, according to China, and the attempts to reduce their possibilities. And here we might expect that China will be increasing tensions, increasing the price for Taiwan to be actually an independent republic, expecting the situation within Taiwan to be changing. And recently, going down party which has, well, we cannot say that they want to be united with China, but rather that is a party looking for, seeking understanding agreement with China. So here we can see that China is actively participating and trying to actively participate in political situation within Taiwan, and also military exercise. It's rather about simply an attempt at blocking Taiwan. And in my opinion, it is rather a realistic option, a scenario, that at a certain moment, especially when the situation, maybe internal situation in the US or generally globally, will be considered by Chinese government as potentially positive, so China may simply introduce a blockade of Taiwan, and through influencing internally Taiwanese demand change in the status quo. And the question arises to what extent the world will respond, to what extent the US will be able to fulfill their obligations which they have towards Taiwan, and also to what extent they will want to enter a direct conflict with China. Thank you very much, Doctor, for having presented this complex situation of Taiwan and, of course, this Chinese aggression or complex relations with the Chinese People's Republic. And now let's return a bit to the role of Turkey, because the topic of our today's conference is diplomacy And this conflict, of course, in the Middle East has been touched on by you gentlemen, but I'm addressing Dr. Konrad Zasztoft with a question in the context of Turkey, the possibility to play this active role in negotiations also regarding Ukraine, because let's keep in mind that the Black Sea area in 1990s was controlled by two countries, so by Russian Federation and Turkey. And of course, with significant role of Ukraine, but after annexation of Crimea, geostrategic situation is changing regarding the Black Sea, and now the role of Turkey as a member state in North Atlantic Alliance, having, as we mentioned earlier, well, Ottoman temptations to influence and stabilize Middle East policy, and actually to the interest of Turkey it is to stabilize the situation regarding Ukraine. So how do you view this perspective of Turkey on active role in peace negotiations? Thank you. Well, the perspective of Turkey is not clear because, let me start from this, because when this full-scale aggression of Russia on Ukraine began, Turkey behaved in a special way, a bit different than other NATO countries. That means they didn't want to get too much involved in sanctions imposed on Russian Federation, and all the time not only they maintained economic relations, but this trade exchange went up in that period between Turkey and Russia, which resulted from the fact that Russia was economically isolated by other countries, and Turkey became a window on the world for Russia. So, for example, some often breaking the sanctions because certain goods being subject to sanctions were re-exported from Turkey with a label made in Turkey, or in Turkiye, as they say now, as Turkish products, but they were actually produced somewhere in the West. Goods which were necessary for Russian industry. And Turkey has been and is a very important partner in energy cooperation for Russia, because it's not only about gas, which is imported from Russia, but also about the fact that Russia built the first nuclear power plant in Turkey at the Mediterranean Sea. So, plus, well, regarding a position of expert circles, Turkish politicians, they kept saying for a long time that this war is not quite clear, that Ukraine is playing a role of a pawn on geopolitical chessboard. Such opinions were quite many, especially in the first and second year of the full-scale war. But after this introduction, I would like to highlight that now situation has changed quite considerably, and it has changed to such an extent that, responding directly to your question, can Turkey be the mediator between Russia and Ukraine? And actually, yes, until recently it could be, because their opinion was ambivalent, and it responded, well, it was actually positively viewed by Moscow, but during this year, big changes took place, and I think not only within this year, but especially in this year, and especially the Middle East. Let me highlight the relations of the Middle East with the area of Eastern Europe and the Black Sea basin. So in December, last year, when Assad regime collapsed, the Syrian problem got solved for Turkey. And at that moment, Turkey does not need to negotiate the questions regarding the Middle East and Syria with Russia. And let me remind that since 2016, within so-called Astana format, Turkey, Russia, and Iran, Turkey was supporting opposition to Assad, Iran and Russia were supporting Assad. Nevertheless, all three countries were frequently meeting. Diplomacy was quite vivid, and paradoxically, this conflict among them was bringing these countries closer together. Well, with the slogan that this is a regional problem we have to solve ourselves without, God forbid, the participation of European countries or the US. Now, this geopolitical system is completely different after collapse of Assad regime, and Turkey may get more involved, as I said, in this situation related to war in Ukraine, but for the reason that already now steps are visible in this direction, and especially the improvement of relation is visible between Ankara and Washington. So now it doesn't seem for Russia to be interested in Turkey to be a place of talks with Ukraine. Recently, there were the proposals for it to be happening in Hungary, and because at this moment it appears that Hungary, Viktor Orban's Hungary, is more friendly from Russian perspective a country than Turkey, led by Erdogan. So it doesn't seem to me that Turkey would, well, we cannot exclude it, but anyway, the place of the talks were, when they happen, it does not need to be Istanbul. It may be, well, we should not exclude it, but I think that in Moscow, Turkey is perceived as, again, back as an opponent, as a country of the enemy bloc. The NATO, a few days ago, a drone attack on Turkish tanker in Odessa happened, transporting liquid gas. This also shows that it was not a coincidence. It was a signal that Turkey is treated as enemy, as opponent by Russia, whereas here, Turkey is playing and will be playing greater and greater role, but actually in the question of not a negotiator, this Turkish diplomacy is, of course, efficient and it may play some role, but now I think that it is, as they say in Turkey, the drone diplomacy. That means Turkey is offering their services as a producer of weapons, and they are selling on quite beneficial terms, selling also know-how, this technology to their clients globally, because we talk of Africa, of Asian countries. So here again, there is quite a lot of interest from Europe, interest in cooperation with Turkey. And why? Because European countries do not cope with the pace of arms production. They didn't do their homework after 2022. And at the moment, Turkey, that has arms industry very well developed, is an opportunity for NATO countries, for Europe. So even a discussion is going on whether the EU funds, which have been allocated for development of arms industry in EU countries, if they can be spent on buying Turkish equipment or some cooperation in arms production, because these companies do not need to be on the territory of Turkey. They can be plants built on the territory of EU countries. Like, for example, this has already happened in the case of ammunition factory in Romania. Well, just by the way, the Turks planned to open up that plant in Poland first, but the decision-making process here was so complex and long-lasting that it appeared that Romanians were more efficient and that Turkish project got to Turkey. But it doesn't close the opportunities which are still present here regarding this arms production cooperation between Turkey and EU countries, but also what follows this, cooperation more broadly in security matters, because as I said in my first input, Turkey more and more comes closer. I mean, the sensitivity and perception of threats by Turkey is coming closer to ours, and earlier the Turks were focused totally on the south, on the Middle East, and not on the north, on the Black Sea. Good, thank you very much. And in the context of peace process, peace negotiations, now addressing Dr. Norbert Obara, because we have a feeling that the two-sided negotiations are actually in stalemate regarding solving this problematic question. So more stress should be paid on multi-party side. So the conflict in Gaza Strip, well, it's to avoid the EU to become net payer regarding the policy, but its influence on policy will be relatively small. But we have the interest of not only China, but also the US, as well as other actors' interests, well, led by Russia. So the question is, what should be the attitude of the EU as an international organization in negotiating permanent solution to this Middle East conflict? But here I mean Palestine-Israeli conflict. War between Israel and Iran, the 12-day war and the war in Gaza Strip, proved and showed the weakening role of the EU as influential entity in international relations. And as I was considering when you were asking about it, the main role which can be played by the EU is the role, the humanitarian role. First of all, we don't know to what extent peace will stay in Gaza, because it is a very fragile agreement. In negotiations themselves about that peace, the role of the EU was just minor, because the main role was played by the US and Israel, but Middle East countries participated in the peace talks. Well, actually, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, but also countries like Azerbaijan, for example. But the EU has the role mainly political and rhetoric role, rather than having an implementation force. Well, not having military force, they didn't have the power, both when the war broke out, neither had the power to end this war. We should also consider the EU as a whole and member states of the European Union, or European countries more broadly, because war in Gaza Strip changed also, for example, the attitude to Palestine. In the UK, for example, which is not in the EU, but they recognize Palestine as a state. Also, attitude of Western communities and the EU communities has changed to Palestinian question and actually gained a negative character in relation to the state of Israel. But what will be decisive of the future of Gaza Strip is, first of all, the United States of America and actually Donald Trump. I don't see any reason to think in international policy, in policy of EU, specific instruments which would be able to influence both Israel as well as stopping Hamas. Here, Hamas has been neutralized, basically, but if somebody had influence on Hamas, it was first of all Qatar or Iran or Turkey, actually, but nobody from the EU. Similarly, Israel maintains exceptionally assertive policy. It is a state which doesn't have alliances. And it is the choice of awareness of Israel, resulting both from history and from creating that state based on their own potential. And of course, of the US. Yes, I wanted to aim at this, but the US actually is the only entity which Israel actually considers serious, especially Donald Trump. The unsuccessful attack in Qatar, Great Alliance, the U.S. Have a base, a military base in Qatar, attack which Israel did not actually preempt. In Doha, Israel was forced to go into temporary agreement in Gaza. Of course, the prospect of EU is different regarding war in Ukraine because it is geographically close war for the EU, and Ukraine is closer culture-wise. It seems to me that situation in the Middle East shows the increasing importance of the EU as entity in international relations. Well, countries differ quite strongly within the EU. Well, for example, very strongly pro-Israeli is the attitude of Germany, historically, but France, or first of all, Ireland. Ireland is a country which is most critically criticizing Israel globally. So it's hard to say that the EU would play any political or diplomatic special role in maintaining peace in the Middle East, or even more broadly in the Middle East. Well, of course, Germany or the UK or France, of course, may be using their diplomatic sources to exert some pressure or international contacts with countries supporting Hamas in the Middle East, because I don't think that Israel would actually count upon so strongly to influence their policy towards Palestine, not only towards Gaza, but also the West Bank. Good. Thank you very much, Doctor, for presenting this perspective and the role of the EU in possibly solving this problem. Although, as a matter of fact, the sources of this conflict are so deep that fast solutions cannot be found. And now in the second part, let us move on to asking Dr. Alexei Polecki regarding Taiwan. But what conclusions does Taiwan draw from the lasting war with Ukraine? Whether in the context of information war, sanctions, and the resilience of allies, can we see that Taiwan is drawing conclusions, or whether it is only watching, and the hitherto resilience is sufficient in the context of a growing threat from the Chinese People's Republic? Welcome, Doctor. Thank you. Well, if we look at Ukraine, here are a few moments which we may conclude from. Well, first, this war is probably the first war which is actually going on online. That means it is from multi-scale wars. So everybody watch, draw their conclusions, learn. Of course, these technological changes are of influence. Well, we commonly talk about drones and so on, but generally the fact that new technologies are changing the character of war and the structure and of armed forces and so on and alike. So therefore, Taiwan is definitely learning here. If we look at Taiwan's preparations, it is visible they are also modernizing their armed forces, but they are also increasing the level of resilience of their society, what generally is related to resilience, and Taiwan is trying to cope with it somehow. So the first conclusion which Taiwan drew, well, there must be a potential price of invasion. It must be such that it would discourage China to invade Taiwan militarily. So level and arms bought by Taiwan and changes at the level of armed forces give a chance to Taiwan to be quite a difficult target to be actually obtained. So strategy of actually deterrence. And second theme regarding Russia. Russia has one maybe key edge over Russia, over Europe especially. Generally, economically, they are not so strong, even militarily, but that prevalence is that price of life in Russia is much lower than in Europe. And this readiness of the Russians to suffer, the fact that elites, on the one hand, do not appreciate the value of human life. On the other hand, the society is actually lenient to such matters. In Russia, we do not see social trends or readiness of the society to do something about it. So the Russians are ready to pay this price. And this is the prevalence, the edge, which at a certain moment may be most important from the potential will perspective. So Taiwan is actually, well, due to the fact that preparatory programs, the level of education on the one hand, and generally getting the society ready for the possibility to have a situation when there will be a necessity to defend the country with arms in hand. It shows that Taiwan understands that this social level is becoming one of the main ones. And China also understands it. China for years have been running an IT war, a cognitive war. For example, for most years, Taiwan has been leading the countries which have the greatest level of attack in cyberspace and in information. So Taiwan also may share their good experience in counteracting. They have elaborated quite interesting response to IT threats, several levels of response and monitoring, which actually cooperates at the level of the country, of the state, and at the level of bottom-up initiatives. On the other hand, I mean, various NGOs and so on. But on the other hand, China really quite strongly are developing towards the IT war, especially with development of AI technologies. In China alone, there are integrations of earlier startups and now large corporations which are actually doing studies in public opinions online based on response of recipients. They are testing all topics important for their government. Also technologies which emerge like response of recipients at a neurological level. So through a camera that is tracing the movement of eyes or response or stopping the movement for some time. So in real time, the system is already giving hints of next contents as need may be. And here Taiwan is a place as a laboratory for China to test all possible influence instruments. Taiwan understands it. Taiwan tries to fight it, well, first through raising the level of educational awareness of the society. But on the other hand, Taiwan is in a difficult situation because they are really a democratic country. They try to maintain freedom of media. They do not have limitations as those which are present in China. And in this situation, it is difficult to fight a country which does not adhere to any rules. So situation here is developing very fast, and here we do not have any visible end point. To what extent this the technological race and social technologies race, to what extent there will be a social resilience in Taiwan, we will see. But at least if we look at opinion polls, most Taiwanese say that they are ready to defend Taiwan against military aggression from China. So here also China have a problem with the fact that the Taiwanese do not feel themselves being Chinese. This is the difference after at least 20 years that the number of Taiwanese who think they are Taiwanese, or at least Taiwanese with some Chinese background, it went up by several times, and the Taiwanese who say that they are Chinese are just above 3%. And this identity change, the social change, is a problem for China in long-term, long-lasting dynamics. So Taiwan keeps learning. Taiwan tries to improve their resilience, both socially but also militarily. Well, thank you very much regarding the value of human life. Well, unfortunately, both Russia and China are identical in it. They don't care about human life. This is Eastern mentality, that first of all, this group identity or value of a group at the cost of an individual. The West is, on the other hand, focused on the dignity of human individual. So this is of key importance, what you said in the context of thinking of a peaceful solution. Now we have still several minutes for questions, opinions from the audience. So who would like to ask Mrs. Speakers a question or share comment? So there is a possibility, and Dr. Andrzej Skórski will be assisting us. So most welcome. Maybe somebody. I can see Dr. Jarosław Kit is getting ready to ask a question. So, Doctor, welcome. Well, no other way out, so I don't know whom I could address this question at all of you. So I'm thinking of the nearest perspective, the prospect of unification or, well, ceasefire or actually division in the Middle East, in Taiwan, I mean China, Russia, in that, because in my input, I was also talking about a threat for the U.S., threat for the whole world, coming from Eurasia being united. It would be a great disaster for all through, for geopolitics, global politics. How do you think, are there any prospects of this kind? And if China, in whatever way, can join in to this unification? Well, we were talking of this strip and root and unifications and nearest prospects. Talk about something like this I mentioned up front. Thank you very much. So this is of key importance, what you asked about, because this conflict in Ukraine shows the fight between democracy and authoritarian attitude. Well, democratic countries, as you mentioned, your input, Ukraine as a democratic country and authoritarian Russia on the other hand. But if we look more broadly in international environment of the EU, authoritarian countries are actually emerging, more and more of them. So the question addressing you, starting from, a question from Jarosław Kit to you. Well, here you actually referred to the famous Mackinder's Heartland concept, which was based mainly on the fact that Eurasia, who is ruling Eurasia? He is ruling the world. Who is ruling Central and Eastern Europe? Well, actually, Ukraine. The question was about China here, but the fact that China is already, that we currently have duopole in international relations and not unipolarity, it seems an obvious thing. China is the greatest economy apart from the US. And regarding on the fact which parameters we measure, they are even the biggest globally, but China are very patient in their policy, which results from at least 4,000 years of their civilization, and it is mainly based on economic influence and gradual militarization of entities which are close to them, like Iran, and not direct aggression. So therefore, this, well, what is mentioned most often, aggression on Taiwan. Mao Zedong said that Taiwan will anyway be part of the mainland, so one single Chinese state. But he didn't know if it would be in 100 years or in 50 years' time. But no doubt that Chinese People's Republic, apart from the US, is today main player in international relations. And if they do not want to increase their support for Iran or Russia or Ukraine, they are doing it only because of their calculations and their patience, because they think in the perspective of dozens of years. So I think that this unification of Eurasia is already in progress. But we have the Middle East, still countries which are great allies in the Middle East, allies to the US. Well, first of all, now we have a visit actually by a ruler of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Salman, in Washington. Well, initially it was to be an agreement to 400 billion US dollars investment of the Saudi Arabia in the US, or buying from the US. Yesterday, Donald Trump said it would be, well, 1 billion. So Saudi Arabia is also in very good relations with China and Russia, and even recently with Islamic Republic of Iran. So the Middle East, mainly from the perspective of economic prospect, is not lost. First of all, for the U.S. So here, and of course, Israel is something, but Israel is a lonely island, which, of course, has the U.S. as a great friend and partner, military and diplomatic partner. But Israel is also playing an ambivalent role, at least in relation to the war in Ukraine or relations with Russia, because this is seldom mentioned, because interests of Russia, say, at least in Syria and, well, of Israel, are coordinated between these two countries. And yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu phoned Putin, where they were consulting the questions of common policy in the Middle East, because for Israel, the main opponent is Iran. And this also influences the aid, the support granted from Israel onto Ukraine. So we have the bloc of global south, like, say, India, policy of the US, which imposed, in order to support Ukraine, imposed great sanctions on entities which would be buying oil from Russia. It strongly affected India, and anti-American moods appeared there, but also India is still remaining partner to the US, but also to Russia, and main opponent to India is China. So this Euro-Asian bloc is, well, it cannot be formed so that it would be a monolith, but China will really be trying to monopolize these areas. Thank you. And Dr. Oleksiy Polecki, in context of China, because there were many themes, so maybe you may want to add something. Yes, thank you. Well, actually, here is the following situation that, of course, there is full consolidation of authoritarian countries. On the one hand, China in itself is a problem in majority of countries in Asia. So in increase of China is perceived by neighbors as potential threat. And I would like to remind you that China, over the 20th century, practically had territorial disputes with their neighbors, all their neighbors, and they still have. So here we can see an opposite movement by countries like Japan, Philippines, and also in this area, Australia and alike, who are trying to be building cooperation together with the U.S., but even outside the U.S., well, among each other, because the threats which result from this more assertive Chinese policy, of course, refer to majority of Asian countries. So this is an obstacle, and different is the situation with the fact that the majority of countries, which especially further south in Asia, simply do not want to be between, within this rivalry between the US and China. So even countries which have great partnerships with China, Vietnam, or Malaysia, which are strongly dependent economically and so on, but they try to balance it. They don't want to be the place of game played among or between powers. As you, Professor, mentioned, it's also a question of India, because, yes, a response to Trump's policy was, for example, a visit by Prime Minister in China in September, but it's an obvious response. But on the other hand, the tensions between China and India are of a geostrategic character. So here I doubt that it would be successful in creating an alliance, because internal potential conflicts between majority of countries in this region simply do not give a possibility them to create something like but here will be a very important role will be played by the situation in the US, both internal, which will be influencing the position of the US in international policy. So we will see. Yes, of course, the role of the U.S. will be of key importance, but for a long time we have been watching that Southeastern Asia starts playing greater and greater role in external policy of the U.S. at the cost of course, involvement in European matters. It is also a generation change. And the last input in the discussion, Dr. Konrad Zasztoft. Yes, so the topic is vast, but I will do my best to very briefly tell you. So I would start provocatively that I do not see this Euro-Asian cooperation. It doesn't need to be perceived as a threat for Europe. It depends on what cooperation, Euro-Asian cooperation we are talking about, because we view it in geopolitical categories. And nothing strange, Dr. Obara actually quoted Mackinder. We have various other theories. Clash of Civilizations of Huntington, and I would mention one more name, which still more influenced the imagination, especially in the post-Soviet area. So Lev Gumilov, who had the concept of super Euro-Asian ethnos, and on the other hand, which will never be in line, in symbiosis with the super ethnos of European character. So actually all these concepts go to the same point, an unavoidable clash and conflict, which must happen here. I am not in full agreement with these theories, because depending on what we are looking at, the word Eurasia started having a dark meaning, I think, in 2013, when Kremlin started promoting this Euro-Asian Union as contradictive to European Union, which finally led to events in Ukraine in 2014 and to really a clash. Although I don't know if we may say clash of civilizations, or Russia clashing with Ukraine and with the EU, with the West. But whether it was unavoidable or not, maybe in Putin's head, but did any historic processes decide about it? And I don't think so. And where do I see any positive aspects from this Euro-Asian cooperation? Well, if we look at what is the element of this Euro-Asian cooperation, well, the whole project of Silk Route, which is not necessarily only a tool in the hands of China. Even if it is, it's a tool which is to the benefit of both those countries which are on the route of the Silk Track. So, I mean, Central Asia, Caucasus, South Caucasus, Turkey also. But also at the other end of this route, there is Europe. So Europeans also may benefit from it, and we can see that this Silk Route in the next edition, it keeps developing. Especially, I am strongly involved in South Caucasus, and I can see how this concept is being developed, especially now by Azerbaijan, due to the right of relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and the opening of the route through Armenia to Turkey via Autonomous Republic of Nakhichevan, which is to be an element of this great Euro-Asian route. And this includes, first of all, Central Asia in this cooperation. Of course, in economic dimension, first of all, but this economic dimension is translated onto security dimension and on strengthening sovereignty of those countries and weakening the influence of totalitarian countries like Russia. Influence of China is there, of course. I would not overestimate it, because regarding Central Asia, because those countries are running multi-vectoral policy, and they have very strong relations with Western countries, but also with the Islamic world and Arabic states, countries of the Arab Gulf, and also with China. So I would not mention hegemony of China already being in place in this region. So I think this last inputs by our speakers may be a wrap-up to our panel. So I would like to thank Dr. Norbert Obara, Dr. Konrad Zasztoft, and Dr. Oleksiy Polecki for very multi-stream inputs. And let me hand over the floor to the Chancellor of this university, Mr. Lies, to wrap up and close our conference. Yes, thank you very much, Professor. Thanked all panelists. So I would like to thank you, Mr. Professor, for very good moderation of the panel and for very interesting conclusions. I think we all deserve a big hand. Honorable ladies and gentlemen, and this trip through regions ended our second discussion panel, which is the last panel at the same time. And quite sadly, I must conclude that our event is gradually coming to its end. So here I would also like to thank some people. First of all, thanks to the team of Regional Center of International Debate, to Andrzej Skórski, who organizationally took care of this event, to Professor Tomasz Stępniewski, who created the program and who actually supported us with his contacts, thanks to which we had an opportunity to listen to very interesting inputs. And also Ms. Monika Drąg, head of WISPA, was involved. Monika, show your face, who also has been with us, present here, and who was responsible for the event. And also, thanks to everybody who had an input to this. So the innovation team, to the WSP University. Next event within Regional Debate Center is behind us. A lot of events ahead of us. Further conferences and debates are already planned. So you're encouraged to watch the web page and social media of the Regional Center of International Debate, Innovative Foundation, and also the web page of University. I wish you a successful afternoon, and hereby I consider the conference closed. Thank you very much.